The Age of Kings has come to an end. The old emperors and chieftains gave up their domains long ago, and the pharaohs, the caliphs, and the archdukes have been consigned to history. But in Russia, the Tsar still reigns supreme, ruling with an iron fist and relishing the wary gaze of his rivals across the world. His name is Vladimir Putin, and he sits at the heart of a global spiderweb. Shrouded in both immense power and intense secrecy, Putin's own life and his networks of influence are incredibly complex. From his early days at the KGB, trying desperately to prop up a crumbling Soviet Union, to his time in the spotlight at the modern Kremlin, Putin's ascent to power has been marked by all the cunning of a chess master, all the corruption and violence of a crime lord. His nation, he works tirelessly to guide on a path of his choosing. His people, he indoctrinates to a political ideology as nuanced as it is authoritarian. His neighbors he treats with all the imperial intent of the Tsars of old, and his enemies across the globe he treats as weaklings. In today's special episode of Warographics, we're going to peel back the propaganda, the obfuscation, and the bravado to reveal the stark and often difficult truths of a leader who has reshaped Russia itself. This is not only a story of power, but it's one of ambition, of corruption, of pride, and a relentless pursuit of a global vision that is entirely his own. So join us today as we delve into the enigma that is Vladimir Putin, the world's most fearsome warlord, and the last of the great and terrible Tsars. The man who would one day become Russia's president for life was born Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin on the 7th of October 1952. He was born to a family already marked by tragedy. His parents had both survived the siege of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, and the war with Nazi Germany before his birth, but both of them had survived only narrowly. His mother had also nearly died from starvation during the siege, and his father had endured serious shrapnel wounds to both legs, which would force him to endure severe pain for the rest of his life. Putin had two older brothers, but never knew either one of them. One, named Victor, died as a toddler during the siege, taken by diphtheria and starvation, and buried in a mass grave with 500,000 others. Some accounts report that Victor was given up to an orphanage days before his death, while others say he was removed against his mother's wishes. In truth, holes in both versions of events would suggest that another tragedy took place instead, and one that the world would likely never learn about. Putin's older brother Albert died in infancy in the 1930s. Of Putin's 6 paternal uncles, 5 died during the war, and as Vladimir Putin himself told the story later in life, his father spent months nursing his mother back to health after he eventually returned home, still recovering from his own wounds. She wouldn't bear her 3rd child until the age of 41. In the wake of such devastation, it should be no surprise at all that young Vladimir had it rough. Even at the moment of his birth, in a nation where 2 out of every 100 infants would die before leaving the hospital and where delivery wards were a mess of blood and feces, Putin was lucky to leave with his mother unscathed. His family wasn't rich by any means. They shared a flat with 2 other families, with a makeshift communal kitchen organized around a 4-burner stove in the hallway. They also weren't nearly the poorest of the poor. They had a television, a telephone, and even access to a dacha, a country house outside the city. His parents attempted to make ends meet, his father in a factory and his mother doing difficult work as a janitor, a baker, a night watchman, and other odd jobs. As they did, little Vlad was left to find his own way. He was kept out of Leningrad's preschools, avoiding outbreaks of disease and the strict regimental discipline that most Russian toddlers were taught. He had little guidance to speak of, just the grown-up drunks and thugs of his apartment block, who he found himself increasingly drawn to in their building's communal courtyard. A small boy for his age, Putin was bullied relentlessly, but nonetheless, he preferred the company of enemies over the poverty, the cold, and the solitude that he faced in his own home. In the crucible that was Leningrad, young Putin was forced to adapt and to fight. At a young age, he started to study the Soviet martial art of Sambo and the older practice of judo, the latter of which he's continued to practice throughout his life. By all accounts, he was a scrappy kid. A childhood friend of his, interviewed for Biography by Darrell Cunningham, described him as follows. He would use any dirty method to win. He would bite, he would scratch, he would beat the boys who were bigger than him, which says a lot about his character. He still very much ignores any rules other people play by. He's still that little kid who fights dirty. Putin would eventually join a street gang in his quarter of the city, an experience that he would later attest taught him an unforgettable rule. If a fight is inevitable, you have to throw the first punch. But even then, Putin's life wasn't that of a young street fighter. He also had to get by as an elementary school student, where the lessons he learned from the street clashed with the quiet and the expectations of the classroom. By the time he joined his peers in first grade, just about to turn 8, young Putin already had a strong sense of identity and a perception of the world in which being a real, hard, grimy thug took precedence over anything academia had to offer. A popular anecdote for his days as a schoolboy involves him being dragged from classroom to classroom by the collar, courtesy of his shop class teacher, after he'd misbehaved. Even in recollections, decades later, Putin's classmates from those days could remember his temper and how long it took him to let go of an issue. He'd calm down for a bit, remember just how mad he was, and then blow his top again in a cycle that could last for hours. Putin was the only child in his school to be barred from joining the Young Pioneers organization, basically a communist version of the Boy Scouts, where every child except him was expected to wear a red kerchief to school every day. Later in life, Putin would explain the incident to biographers as such. Said a biographer, "Why did you not get inducted into the Young Pioneers until 6th grade? Were things really so bad?" Putin replied, "Of course, I was no pioneer, I was a hooligan." Biographer asked, "Are you putting on airs?" And Putin said, "Are you trying to insult me? I was a real thug." But Putin's tendency to rage against the machine wouldn't last forever. By the time he turned 13 in 6th grade, he was able to change his outlook on academia. He was rewarded immediately with membership in the Young Pioneers and election to his class chairmanship, similar to the idea of a class president. In his teenage years, Putin was a curious student, reading the likes of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, all of which were good choices for a kid growing up in Soviet Russia. Fighting was now left outside the classroom, although he didn't leave it behind completely. His former classmates would later tell of 15 or 16-year-old Putin executing powerful judo throws on the older drunks and troublemakers of his city. In one incident, Putin absolutely bodied a poor kid who was chasing after his friend, not realizing that the two were playing a game of chase. In those same years, Putin also started developing an interest in spycraft, or that is what a young teenager would imagine spycraft to be. He began to intensify his focus on the practice of martial arts. He instilled his own sense of an intelligence officer's work ethic, and he hunted for all the books, pamphlets, and films that he could find on the KGB. At his desk in the family dacha, he kept a portrait of one Yan Berzin, the founder of Soviet military intelligence. And that fascination persisted, even as the appeal to be a cosmonaut in Russia's early spacefaring years was too much for most of his classmates to ignore. For Putin, it was all about the KGB. He visited an office in Leningrad and spoke to a KGB representative about his job prospects even before he finished his secondary education. The advice the KGB gave him in return? Become a lawyer. We'll reach out to you. Eventually, the KGB would keep their word and do just that. Putin kept his end of the bargain too. To the surprise of just about everybody in secondary school, he decided that he was going to apply to Leningrad State University, one of the best institutions in all of Soviet Russia. His family and school advisors found the prospect unlikely, especially with grades that ranged from excellent in some subjects to just passable in others, but he was able to prove his doubters wrong. Just how he got in is still unclear. Perhaps he took advantage of the Soviet university system where oral and written exams were the basis for admission and transcripts basically didn't matter. Or perhaps the KGB had marked him as a promising recruit and pulled some strings on his behalf. In 1970, fresh out of secondary school and with a command of both English and German under his belt, he enrolled at Leningrad State University in their law program. During that time, he owned a car, a rare and very expensive possession for someone his age, after his parents won it in a lottery. They decided to gift it to their son rather than sell it and upgrade to a better flat. Whether that meant that the family had more wealth than they let on, or just that they enjoyed spoiling him, we'll probably never know. While at university, Putin kept his head down, worked hard, joined the Communist Party as required of all law candidates, and wrote his thesis, eventually graduating in 1975. It was then that the KGB circled back to Putin, choosing him from over 100 members of his graduating cohort. His recruiter, after 4 or 5 meetings with him, apparently liked what he saw, describing his new recruit as not particularly outgoing, but energetic, flexible, and brave. Most importantly, he was good at connecting with people fast, a key quality for a KGB officer, especially if he plans to work in intelligence. After he pushed through training, he was posted to his home city of Leningrad to conduct internal intelligence work with enough success that he was granted the honor of a year's study in the KGB's Central Intelligence Academy. This was a rare opportunity for someone of Putin's stature and was usually reserved for Communist Party elites. But it was a testament to how Putin seemed to operate in those years. Head down, pushing forward, and operating in patriotic interest to his home nation. It was also one step closer to Putin's long-term goal, to wield the sort of power he believed the real players in the KGB had. As he told biographers later in life, "I was most amazed by how a small force, a single person really, can accomplish something an entire army cannot. A single intelligence officer could rule over the fates of thousands of people. At least, that's how I saw it." For a man of Putin's high ambitions, his first few years in the KGB must have been something of a disappointment. After he completed his initial training, he joined the pencil pushers, stuck behind a desk and responsible for the production of a truly incredible amount of information. In this era, the KGB wrote an unbelievable number of reports, collected mountains of tips, put unnecessary tails on potential suspects, tapped many thousands of phone lines, and engaged in deep speculative analysis of very mundane perceived threats. A very small proportion of that information would ever be used for anything, or even looked at again after it was sent upward, but that wasn't the responsibility of agents at Putin's level. In an organization that believed the actions of one single dissident could cascade into an overthrow of the entire Communist Party, Putin and his co-workers were sentinels, a first line of defense that watched for any conceivable sign of trouble. That tedium made up most of Putin's early tenure at the KGB, interrupted only by a stint at officers' school that he would later describe as having been entirely unremarkable. Assigned to his home city of Leningrad, Putin was tasked with counterintelligence work with the intent to catch enemy spies. But since Leningrad had no embassies to speak of and very little other intelligence value, he didn't really have much to do. Before long, he had spent 4.5 years enduring the KGB's hyper-specific brand of monotony. Now, those years weren't a total waste for Putin. During that portion of his life, he met a young woman named Lyudmila Alexandrovna Okorodnaya, who was, at the time she met Putin, a flight attendant who worked on hopper flights across the Soviet Union. The two would date for over 3 years, a courtship that by any normal Soviet or Russian standard was shockingly prolonged. When Putin eventually married Lyudmila, he was 31 years old, by which age over 90% of Russian men would have already tied the knot. As Putin and other sources later described, the future dictator was not much of a romantic or even a communicator at all. As author Masha Gessen put it in the biography The Man Without a Face, quote, Lyudmila's description of the day he finally proposed paints a picture of a failure to communicate so profound that it is surprising these people actually managed to get married and have 2 children. Long story short, Putin pointed out all of his self-perceived negative characteristics to his future wife to the point that she thought he was going to break up with her, but instead, he proposed. Smooth work, Vlad. In 1984, Putin received a blessing from his bosses in the KGB. He was offered the chance to attend the organization's proper spy school, the one that trained agents who were capable of the sort of intense, high-stakes work that Putin had imagined in his youth. Putin saw the opportunity and he ran with it. He made a point of showing up to training in 3-piece suits, no matter the heat, and he went to great lengths to demonstrate his ideological and intellectual commitment to the mission of the KGB. His work wasn't unimpeachable. One of his instructors flagged him for a lowered sense of danger, perhaps relating to the fearlessness drilled into him in his days as a young thug. He was also noted as having been closed off and unsociable, at least compared to the other recruits in the cohort. But he was a very talented candidate with a mastery of a very important language, German, and he was able to pass the course and even be appointed class foreman. Between Putin's German skills and his demonstrated ability, it was clear that he would end up traveling to a posting in Germany, but that was either an assignment that could either be very good or very bad for his overall career aspirations. You see, at the time, Germany was still divided in two, and to be posted to West Germany would have been a dream come true for someone like Putin. The work over there was real spycraft, there was intrigue and danger, and for someone of Putin's standing, the money he would have made on that side of the Iron Curtain far eclipsed what he could make anywhere else. But Putin's luck had ran out. Instead of being sent into hostile territory, Putin was assigned to East Germany and not even to East Berlin, where something of consequence might still be happening. Instead, he was sent to Dresden, a city firmly under Soviet control and with hardly more intrigue than Putin had enjoyed in Leningrad. Although he was tasked with the cultivation of assets and informants, there were very few informants to be recruited and very little spy work to be done in Dresden. What little Putin did work on mostly consisted of finding people who could provide intel on US and NATO military installations in West Germany, where Putin himself did not seem likely to go. This, finally, appeared to be the straw that broke the future dictator's back. By all accounts of this period in Putin's life, he conceded defeat. He stopped exercising, he put on a good deal of weight, he focused on his home life and his 2 young daughters, and at least outwardly, he seemed to be pretty depressed. Much of his work consisted of tracking down and speaking with foreign students at Dresden's Technical University, mostly from Latin America, and then being told that the KGB's financial offers were not enough to entice them into espionage. To the extent that he made connections with other agents, much of his inquiries were to secure small curios and trinkets they'd brought back to East Germany from the West, taking them for his own personal use. And as Putin entered a period of personal decline, he was forced to sit back and watch as the Soviet Union did the same. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet premier, had risen to his post the same year that Putin arrived in Dresden, and in the following years, Putin and the rest of the KGB were stuck largely unable to intervene in what they saw as Gorbachev's dismantling of Soviet culture. At this time, most members of the KGB were still party loyalists, not to the man in charge, but to the grand vision of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's willingness to loosen a hold on the Soviet bloc, his willingness to approach the global West, and his rejection of Soviet principles of governance were enough to mark the man as a clear enemy. But this time, when something Putin loved fell under threat, he did not respond with the same street-fighting vigor that he might have done in his younger days. Instead, he and the rest of his office sat idly by, stewing in whatever existential dread they may have had. Although some sources, most prominently The Phenomenal Book, Putin's People by Catherine Belton, suggest that Putin may have been part of the KGB's work in Dresden to prepare the organization for a transition into rockier times, these suspicions will likely remain forever unconfirmed. When protests started to break out in Dresden, Putin was not on the front lines trying to fight back. In fact, in one incident in early 1990 outside the Stasi building in Dresden, Putin was present to watch the building be stormed by an angry mob. Putin would later tell biographers how bewildered he was by the incident, but that his mood shifted when the mob then targeted his own KGB headquarters. When he found himself among the only KGB personnel standing between the mob and the destruction of his workplace, Putin attempted to defuse the situation rather than fight, and claimed that he was only an interpreter when the people in the crowd responded aggressively. When he tried to contact his allies in the military, he was informed that Moscow hadn't yet decided how to respond. He was left for hours before a decision was made, forced to hide indoors and burn documents until his wood stove split from the heat. In interviews a decade later, Putin would describe the feeling of that moment. To quote him, "I realized that the Soviet Union was ill. It was a fatal disease called paralysis. A paralysis of power." The quote ends. Before long, Putin would return to Leningrad with his family, moving back into his parents' small apartment and returning to the same dismal workplace that had left 5 years prior. Except now, Leningrad too was different. Dissidents were unafraid to protest openly in the streets or hold court on topics like freedom and human rights in public spaces. Now, when the KGB or other elements in the government cracked down, the people were unafraid to fight back. When a television broadcaster hoodwinked Soviet censors and played an interview with a dissident named Andrei Sakharov in 1988, nobody disappeared, nobody lost their jobs. When in 1989 a civilian electoral committee attempted to explain to citizens how the Soviets' new voting system would work, nobody stopped them, and the Communist Party was absolutely eviscerated in parliament. When a spat between Premier Gorbachev and the dissident leader Sakharov was broadcast live from that same parliament, the public took Sakharov's side, and when Sakharov passed away 6 months later, the public took to the streets in vast pro-democracy marches. When the leader of the marches, a woman named Marina Sarye, was arrested the following day, Leningrad's newspapers didn't try and make an example out of her. The headline? Arrested for mourning Sakharov. The rapid changes within Putin's beloved Soviet Union were enough to make him despair. But even if he might not have realized it at the time, the unrest was enough to change the game in Leningrad. No longer was Putin's station a mere question of busy work, collecting reports that might never be read. Instead, he was finally in the position to engage in active work to protect the Union. The game he played wouldn't be a cat-and-mouse exercise in hunting down dissidents. After all, the dissidents just didn't bother to hide anymore. Instead, his task would be to ride the coming wave, extending his influence and advancing the interests of his allies while making sure that he could endure the changes coming from all sides. Rather than stick around inside the KGB's formal apparatus in Leningrad, Putin went back to his alma mater, Leningrad State University. It was normal in Soviet Russia for KGB operatives to work inside a wide range of businesses, educational institutions, and cultural programs, and at Leningrad State, Putin was tasked with helping the university build relationships with foreigners and facilitate travel for its own students. But Putin wouldn't last long. Instead, he formed a relationship with one Anatoly Sobchak, a law professor from the city who had become a nationally recognized pro-democracy figure. Sobchak wasn't the sort of person who cared much about Athenian ideals or lively debate. Instead, he had taken the Leningrad City Council by storm, taking control of the city's political leadership and starting to set himself up for a run at the presidency. It's unknown how exactly Putin came into contact with Sobchak. The official narrative, which is widely recognized as a fabrication, holds that Putin knew Sobchak from his days as a student. Sobchak later told a different story, and one that was no more trustworthy. That he hadn't known Putin, was a KGB officer, but ran into him accidentally and got talking to him after remembering him from his younger years. More likely, according to author Mash Gerson, is that Putin was chosen by Sobchak specifically because of his KGB bona fides. Sobchak would have been a much more natural fit with that sort of man than the bespectacled, turtleneck-wearing ideologues of the democratic movement. Putin was quiet, worldly, well-connected, and whatever ambition he had, he kept it to himself. When Putin requested a transfer, the KGB, allegedly, was all for it, and there's no actual record of whether Putin ever really said goodbye to the organization. He claims to have left in 1990 because of a blackmail scheme, but no record of a resignation letter has ever been found. And that was going to be pretty important, because as political division grew into violence and food shortages across the Soviet bloc, 1991 saw the KGB and the rest of the Soviet old guard make one final play for control. Their best effort came in the form of a coup, and since we've already covered that coup at length on this very channel, we'll suffice it to say for now that the coup was not successful in forcing Premier Gorbachev out. But it did lead to a sort of behind-the-scenes game of musical chairs, in terms of who actually ran things inside the Soviet Union. Gorbachev didn't lose his job, but he did lose his power, which instead went to a name that's going to become instrumental in Vladimir Putin's story: Boris Yeltsin, then chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet. Yeltsin had also been elected president of Russia just months before, meaning that when Russia became the largest state to splinter away from the fallen Soviet Union, it was Yeltsin who took his place at its head. In Leningrad, now known by its modern name of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak became the mayor, and Vladimir Putin became deputy mayor for international relations. It was the first real political position he would hold, and he would weather the coup and the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union from his place at Sobchak's right hand. How involved he was in that coup is difficult to say. The pro-democracy leader we mentioned earlier, Marina Salye, would later allege that Putin had arranged for meat meant to alleviate hunger in Leningrad to instead be redirected to Moscow. The general idea here would have been that when the coup plotters took power, they would have been able to put food back onto Moscow's shelves, putting themselves back into the good graces of ordinary Muscovites. But when Salye and her allies in Moscow attempted to bring their allegations to senior ministers in Moscow, they were ignored. This, after all, was in 1992, after the Soviet Union's fall, and by then, Vladimir Putin was a man in politics. Now, we've introduced you at length to Vladimir Putin, KGB agent, but now we've got to introduce you to Vladimir Putin, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. After a short time spent acclimating to his new role, Putin settled into public life as a highly influential figure. In his work, he came across as visibly unemotional, even aloof, cultivating an image of utter unflappability in both public and private. His own accounts of the time tell of months spent trying to assert a state monopoly on the casino industry, even when those efforts put him at odds with laws he considered unjust. The accounts of Maria Salye, who was by then consumed with the effort to figure out just what Putin was up to, allege that he had instead spent his time entering St. Petersburg into a wide range of legally questionable contracts in which he directly exported Russian natural resources in exchange for food. Putin had chosen contractual partners directly, rather than allow for open competitions. His office appeared to forego the signatures and seals needed to approve these efforts, and funnily enough, the food never actually arrived, while the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in kickbacks were flowing into St. Petersburg, where that food should have been. Where the money ultimately ended up is unknown. But when Salye attempted to go through Mayor Sobchak to get Putin removed, she was ignored yet again. Even for this time in Russian history, where corruption and grift was present at a massive scale all up and down the legal system, the allegations against Putin were on another level. But it was Salye and the St. Petersburg City Council who would be punished for investigating him, not the other way around. Their organization was dissolved, taking with it the only people with real insight into what Putin was up to. Salye would become a political organizer, continuing to sound the alarm, but without access or means to reveal new information, she was powerless to make any change. Putin's network of influence rose out of his position in charge of most of St. Petersburg's finances. Similar to how the Soviet Union leveraged its control over money and communication into political domination, Putin aspired to do the same thing. He took control not just over foreign trade, but over all manner of private business within St. Petersburg. When he did, he wouldn't shut down a business or install himself at the head, but he would link those businesses and trade relationships inextricably with the city and himself. He became Sobchak's indispensable representative on all matters law enforcement, leveraging his old KGB contacts in the new FSB and forming connections with organized criminals as he did so. He gained control over media access to the city's inner workings, amplifying the messages that he wanted and suppressing those that he didn't. Those who he knew and trusted were given lucrative assets that they would grow and grow and grow until they became the oligarchs of today. By enabling the greed of those searching for profit, and by nurturing and exploiting fear in those who would stand against him, he was able to incorporate all manner of new allies and acquaintances into a broader network, one in which Putin himself would be at the heart. As the 1990s stretched on, and the new Russian Federation stumbled through its early days as a modern sovereign nation, Mayor Sobchak fell on hard times. He was held accountable for just about every political and social ill in St. Petersburg, some rightly, some wrongly, and by the time he ran for re-election in 1996, his city was lagging far behind the rest of Russia in terms of economic recovery. Putin didn't stand directly in the voters' crosshairs like Sobchak, and was lucky that he didn't. Sobchak's campaign manager in the waning days of that election cycle was attacked twice, first with sulfuric acid, and then by shooting, although he did survive. Putin, however, was either anonymous enough or powerful enough that when he stepped into the campaign manager role, he left it with as many fingers and as many toes as when he went in. He did, however, emerge without a boss. Sobchak lost the election to his own public works deputy, and Putin, choosing a display of loyalty instead of opportunism, declined a job with the next administration. Next, Putin made his way to Moscow. There he became the deputy head of the Presidential Property Management Office, a job that gave him substantial access to resources and people without demanding much in the way of public visibility. When Sobchak fell ill under questionable circumstances and was placed into a Moscow hospital under scrutiny from an investigator, Putin arranged for his transfer to a trusted doctor's care, and then sprung him from Moscow entirely a couple of days later, getting Sobchak to Paris, where he could live relatively safely. Putin's time in Moscow was far quieter than St. Petersburg had been. He had time to write and defend a dissertation in economics, one that has since been studied and found to be heavily plagiarized for an American textbook. The newly minted Dr. Putin may or may not have muddied the waters around his former boss's ongoing investigation, and he leveraged his connections for his own benefit too, getting himself promoted to the civil service rank of first-class active state counselor, basically the equivalent to the military rank of Army General or Navy Admiral. The promotion came by the decision of President Yeltsin, a man who was becoming more and more aware of the young man from Leningrad within his ranks. In May of 1998, Putin was appointed first deputy chief of the presidential staff, yet again keeping Putin in the deputy roles he so enjoyed. Close enough to the ultimate decision makers that he wielded tremendous influence, but private enough that few outside the Kremlin would ever know his name. But that position wasn't going to last very long. Exactly 2 months later, he was granted a new position, Director of the Federal Security Service, the FSB. Putin's place as FSB chief was something of a homecoming. After all, the FSB was the direct descendant of the KGB, for whom Putin had spent years toiling away, and it was an organization where he wielded tremendous influence all up and down the hierarchy. A unit leader here, a bureaucrat there, a pencil pusher halfway across a country, or a spy halfway across the world may have at least heard of Putin before. Many had met him, and some owed their careers to him. His start at the FSB was a rocky one, though. He was entering the organization in a moment immediately after thousands of officers had been dismissed en masse, and his low rank made the generals Putin worked with uncomfortable. His association to Anatoly Sobchak and other unsavory figures made him even less palatable. Putin would carry out his orders as hatchet man and dismiss 2,000 agents, and again, the act became an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty. This time, that loyalty was shown to Yeltsin by fearlessly pushing his way through the wave of firings when most people in his position would have tried to avoid the task. He brought in loyalists from St. Petersburg, insisted on remaining the FSB's first civilian director rather than accept a promotion to general, and brought the organization in line with what Yeltsin expected. During Putin's tenure at the FSB, he focused the organization toward economic security, building ties with Russia's budding class of ultra-rich oligarchs and creating mechanisms to surveil and regulate the flow of finances. Also on Putin's mind, tamping down on political extremism, fighting terrorism, protecting state secrets, and putting together a surveillance apparatus that could respond to one of humanity's newest inventions, the internet. From his vantage point, Putin was able to see at least some advanced warning of the financial collapse Russia would soon face, and he took steps to insulate some of his country's largest wealth holders against that collapse. Putin wouldn't get credit for the economic recovery that allowed Moscow to skirt disaster. Instead, that went to Russia's newest prime minister, a man named Yevgeny Primakov. But Putin would benefit nonetheless, both from the new connections he had made and his newfound means of control over some of the biggest financial players in all of Russia. Putin's next test would come in the form of a scandal within the FSB itself, when he inherited a scandal in which 5 FSB officers had lodged a formal complaint after they'd been directed to assassinate a prominent oligarch. The officers had tried to go through their FSB superiors but had been ignored. Putin disdained officers who took such a public route to voice their concerns, but he led a crackdown based on their claims anyway. He dealt with the person who had given the alleged assassination order, not by firing him, but moving him to another division. Thus, Putin avoided the worst of the scandal, but also avoided making enemies. Everybody wins, but mostly Putin wins. As for the leader of the 5 whistleblowing officers, well, his name was Alexander Litvinenko, and he would die an incredibly painful death in London in 2006 after being poisoned with polonium-210. In the following months, Putin's relationship with the new Prime Minister Primakov would sour. Primakov didn't like how Putin had replaced veteran FSB officers with his own people. Putin didn't like how Primakov had asked him to wiretap the leaders of Russia's Liberal Party. Before long, that push and pull was brought to the attention of Boris Yeltsin, who consistently took Putin's side in the disputes. When a sex scandal around a friend of Primakov's led Yeltsin to suspect larger problems, Putin was there to fan the flames. And when a Jewish democratic leader was shot in St. Petersburg in November of 1998, Putin benefited from an efficient, clean investigation that he led personally. Concern about Primakov's judgment led to fears that he might try and threaten Yeltsin's political reforms with a presidential run of his own, and by April of 1999, Yeltsin had decided that it was best to dispense of Primakov while he still could. By that time, Yeltsin was in a whole lot of trouble in domestic Russian politics. His illegal war in Chechnya, his cuts against the military, the economic and social instability of everyday Russians, and a whole slew of other societal ills were blamed squarely on him. Some, we must emphasize, were not entirely fair criticisms, but most were. And by April, Yeltsin was staring down the barrel of impeachment charges. Yeltsin got rid of Primakov 3 days prior to the impeachment vote, meaning that Primakov would be unable to assume the role of acting president if the impeachment did succeed. The move risked unifying the anti-Yeltsin opposition into agreement on getting rid of him, and it was functionally the same as getting held up with a gun and deciding to punch a mugger in the face, but it worked. The new prime minister was not named Vladimir Putin, but it got Yeltsin thinking that while his short-notice replacement was doing a fine job as an empty suit, the president was going to want to choose a successor personally. A few names made the shortlist. Boris Nemtsov was a regional governor who simply wouldn't do well in the national spotlight. Liberal leader Grigory Yavlinsky was in the pocket of his own political party. Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov was too close to former Prime Minister Primakov. And Railways Minister Nikolai Aksyonenko was highly competent, but was disliked by most of the Russian Duma. But Vladimir Putin, that was an interesting idea. By early 1999, Yeltsin was a man increasingly under siege. He was in poor health. He had been abandoned by most of his acquaintances and his less dedicated allies. His closest advisors were a couple of former and current chiefs of staff, a prominent oligarch and his daughter. They were known around Moscow as the family, and none of them were suitable to take Yeltsin's place. His popularity across Russia was in the single digits, and he had very good reason to believe that a successor administration could score easy political points by prosecuting him. Now, Putin wasn't an obvious answer to any of these problems, but as we already know, he had a few key attributes that Yeltsin would have been lucky to find. He was going to be loyal to the person who elevated him, no matter what controversy came with his support, and he was going to keep a low profile and be the savvy operator he had always been, rather than grandstanding or causing a fuss. He had become known to the oligarch who was still backing Yeltsin, a man named Boris Berezovsky. When he refused to take a bribe Berezovsky had offered him during his days as deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. Since then, Berezovsky had taken an interest in Putin, and they had formed a deep relationship after Putin moved to Moscow. According to some sources, Putin regarded Berezovsky far lower than Berezovsky regarded him, but Putin had made sure to keep him as an ally, even going to his wife's birthday party long after the rest of Russian high society had abandoned Berezovsky as a Yeltsin loyalist. Now, with Yeltsin clutching at straws in the waning days of his administration, Berezovsky was the one to reach out to Putin for help. The conversation happened in the elegant French town of Biarritz, where Putin was taking a vacation by the sea in July of 1999. And just a brief aside here, it would come out later that Putin had given French intelligence the slip, and they had no idea that Putin was present in their country. After a full day of debate in Biarritz, Putin agreed to be floated as a potential successor, but only if Yeltsin agreed and offered him the role personally. That conversation would happen a few days later, with Yeltsin meeting not the shadowy FSB director, but with the man named Vladimir Putin for the first time. Berezovsky would describe Yeltsin's takeaways in an interview years later to quote, "Boris Nikolaevich had a complicated reaction. At least, I remember him saying one thing to me. He seems all right, but he's kind of small." The quote ends. Yeltsin's own writings reveal a deeper familiarity with his eventual successor, who had impressed him with his work in St. Petersburg, his refusal to be slowed down by political rivalries in Moscow, and his toughness on political extremism. He had been highly competent as a spy chief, and he had gained valuable foreign policy experience as secretary of the Russian Security Council. Overall, Putin was a satisfactory choice for Yeltsin. The plan was to elevate him to the post of prime minister, putting Putin in an advantageous position to run for election to the presidency shortly afterward. He was a compromise candidate, one who would be agreeable to most influential people, giving him at least a chance to defeat former Prime Minister Primakov in the general election. The point wasn't to produce a leader that could match Primakov's ideological force or to offer a policy alternative to what Primakov was proposing. The point was that Putin was a candidate that just about everybody in Russia could stomach, in a political environment where every other name was deeply polarizing. As author Masha Geeson put it, everyone could invest this grey, ordinary man with what they wanted to see in him. Vladimir Putin was confirmed as Prime Minister of the Russian Federation in mid-August 1999 with the support of most of the Russian Duma. Immediately, it was obvious that Putin would be there for a good time and not for a long time. Yeltsin had already announced that he saw Putin as his successor, and Putin had publicly agreed to run for the presidency. At first, Putin's aspirations weren't taken seriously by a large portion of Russia. He was a clear compromise, a nobody who very few people outside of Moscow or St. Petersburg had ever heard of. And he was expected to eventually spin out of the premiership like everybody who had come before him. According to most onlookers, both in Russia and around the world, he was a puppet. But just hours into his new role, Putin began to show signs that he was not interested in sitting idly by. In his first television interview, he threatened to imprison striking workers, and shortly afterward, he authorized airstrikes into Chechnya and gave pay rises to the Russian soldiers fighting in the Caucasus. He centralized the Russian chain of command so that decisions ran through him rather than Yeltsin, and within 2 weeks, his forces had lain waste to large portions of the Russian Republic of Dagestan at the expense of many of the civilians there. But Putin wasn't going to start his tenure just by playing strongman in the Caucasus. In his mind, the violence in Dagestan had the potential to be a valuable piece in a broader chess game, one that he would leverage in order to elevate himself further and further toward the presidency. And that's when the explosions began. On August the 31st, just more than 2 weeks after Putin rose to the post of premier, a small homemade bomb went off just 200 meters from Red Square. 30 people were injured in the attack, one was killed. A few days later, on September the 4th, a truck bomb detonated in a town in Dagestan, in a building housing ethnic Russian border guards and their families, killing 58 and wounding 100. An hour later, a second, much larger truck bomb was found and disarmed outside a military hospital. A week later, an apartment building was blown up in the Moscow suburbs, killing 106 and injuring almost 250. Days later, another similar blast killed 119 and injured 200. On September the 16th, a fifth attack came in a city southeast of Moscow, killing 19 and injuring 69. All 5 attacks were blamed on Chechen militants under the command of a warlord named Shamil Basayev, who was leading the ongoing violence in the Caucasus. But that official narrative was challenged for the first time on September the 22nd when an off-duty bus driver stumbled onto a situation that looked suspicious outside of his apartment block. When he finally got the police to respond, a makeshift bomb was found in the basement, made from 3 110-pound sacks labeled sugar, but actually carrying an explosive called hexagon. The problem was, the off-duty bus driver had spotted European Russians planting the bomb, not Chechens, and one of them had made a suspicious phone call to the FSB headquarters in Moscow. Before long, it came out that the local police had actually detained 2 suspects that same night, but they had both produced FSB paperwork and had been released. More than a day after the bomb scare, the FSB announced that the whole thing had been a training exercise using a dummy device, and the gas detector that indicated hexagon had been malfunctioning. But perhaps worst of all, the Russian public learns that the Speaker of the Duma had mistakenly interpreted a meeting of the Russian parliament to tell them that the September 16th attack had happened, except he did it on September the 13th, when no such bombing had yet taken place. Now, it should be clear here, in the years since these bombings, evidence has come to light suggesting that perhaps not all of the bombings were the work of the FSB, and many experts, even in the West, will still contend that the FSB wasn't behind the campaign at all. But none of that clarifying information was available to the people in Russia at the time, and so it wouldn't matter at all. So let's quickly recap, shall we? A series of 5 terrorist attacks across Russia had killed no fewer than 303 people and injured well over 600. They had been blamed on the obvious suspects, a violent Chechen warlord who could plausibly have ordered an attack of that nature. But then, operatives from the same major intelligence agency that Putin had been in charge of just a few weeks ago had been discovered planting bombs that would have been used in a similar attack. The FSB's response hadn't been to condemn its agents as having gone rogue or to call the whole thing a lie. They instead waffled and issued statements that stank of a cover-up. Putin wasn't the only one who caught public blame for the incident, though. He was too new in his post, most people thought, and he wouldn't have been able to coordinate such an operation on limited time. Nevertheless, the Russian press had a field day, pilling the operation on the Yeltsin administration and wrapping Putin in with the allegations. The public seemed disinterested in a revolt, and Putin was able to maintain his grip on power without much consequence. If anything, his business-like efficiency in waging the Second Chechen War won him back over to the people's side. He demonstrated that he could be an effective leader in moments of crisis, even despite character attacks that would have most Russian politicians foaming at the mouth. As approval of the Yeltsin administration continued to decline, approval of Putin began climbing, to the point that he began to seem less and less like an empty suit and more like a real contender for the presidency. With public opinion clearly moving in the direction Yeltsin wanted, he responded by stepping back and further pushing responsibilities toward Putin. When he was supposed to attend a summit in New Zealand, he called Bill Clinton and told him that Putin would be attending instead, slipping into the conversation Yeltsin's own belief that Putin was soon to be president. That was new information for the United States, who had no idea that Putin was being groomed as a successor. Yeltsin also took pains to get Putin connected with competent campaign staff, people who would carry him through both a Duma election in late 1999 and the presidential election in the summer of 2000. A new political party was invented for him, called Unity, and a large proportion of Russia's governors and oligarchs got behind him. When hostilities in Chechnya picked up, Putin responded by showing more of his street side, not hiding the part of himself that had once dreamed of being a thug, but making it clear that this thug did his street fighting in defense of the Russian people. By the end of October, public polling had him as the frontrunner among presidential candidates compared to just 2% support 2 months prior. Then Boris Yeltsin presented Putin with the idea that, as Yeltsin believed, would make his election in 2000 almost inevitable. Yeltsin would resign. When he did, Putin would be promoted to acting president, making him a political incumbent for the election several months later. Putin attempted to resist, but it was of little use in the face of Yeltsin's convictions. On New Year's Eve 1999, Yeltsin made a public address. It went in part, quote, "We, who have been in power for many years, must go. Many of our hopes were not realized. What we thought was easy has proven painfully difficult. I would like to ask forgiveness from those of you who hoped that we would be able to make a leap in just one go from the grey, stagnant, totalitarian past to a bright, prosperous, and civilized future. I, myself, believed in this." When the speech ended, so did the Yeltsin era, and the age of Vladimir Putin officially began. Acting president. In his first moments as Russia's new acting president, Vladimir Putin seized the same pen that Boris Yeltsin had used to designate him as his successor and granted Yeltsin immunity from prosecution. Thus, in his first moments as Russia's new acting president, Vladimir Putin shot himself in the foot. Now, the reasoning wasn't half bad. Russia had never done a peaceful transition of power before, and there was legitimate reason to set precedent that not every recent president should immediately be prosecuted for political points. But there were a few key problems. Firstly, Yeltsin didn't actually know that the pardon was about to happen, and he would later describe it himself as a rather questionable decision. Secondly, it had the practical effect of making it look as if Putin's entire rise to power had been a charade meant both to elevate a manipulative public official and ensure that Yeltsin practically got immunity for himself. Now, from an optics perspective, it was barely short of catastrophic. In the coming days, Putin undertook a reshuffle of the Russian government, laying clear plans for who would go where if Putin did become the elected president. He remained in his post as prime minister, continuing to oversee the war in Chechnya, and ushered out several of his political enemies, as well as officials who were seen as too loyal to Yeltsin. Many of Putin's old friends from St. Petersburg were elevated to national positions, including one man who would eventually become a key Putin ally, Dmitry Medvedev. People who had known Putin from business dealings or his time in the St. Petersburg government or from the KGB found themselves promoted. Although most of the time, Putin at least prioritized competence as a factor in choosing the names that he did. Competence, of course, has nothing to do with whether or not a person is deeply corrupt, and many of Putin's appointees were, but he saw each of them as being trustworthy and importantly loyal. And then it was campaign season, where Putin had all the support necessary to amplify whatever message he chose to put out. And that message was what we would describe today as classic Putin. A strong man, One who was vigorous, vibrant, combative, and utterly unbothered by the idiots trying to stand in his way. On the same day he was appointed acting president, he traveled to Chechnya to spend New Year's Eve in the barracks with Russian troops, broadcast on live TV, of course, and when he returned 2 months later, he flew not in a presidential jet, but in the co-pilot seat of an Su-27 fighter jet that he claimed had flown himself for a few minutes in midair. He put out bold and sweeping policy proposals, including a long personal statement in which he outlined the outrageous price that Russia had paid for its time under communism, and illustrated a unique path forward, one that was fundamentally unlike either the Soviet Union or the modern West. He stressed his intent to return Russia to its great power status and counterbalance a world order that the United States at the time was dominating unilaterally. And finally, he allowed the world to see bits of his personality. His relative lack of an ego, his disinterest in telling everybody about how powerful he was, and even his sense of humor, which, despite being very, very Russian, did register for Western audiences. The Putin campaign was not without controversy, though, and it definitely wasn't without pain. For one thing, Putin's old mentor, Anatoly Sobchak, had recently returned from his exile in Paris, and when Putin began his electoral run, he agreed to help with the campaign. Whether he was successful is another matter. He described Putin publicly as the new Stalin, as if it was a good thing, and he frequently contradicted messaging that Putin's own biographers and propagandists were trying to get consistent. Now, we'll leave it to you to connect the dots on what happened next, but in February of 2000, Sobchak would be asked to urgently fly out to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad and campaign there, where he would die, the official cause of death being listed as a massive heart attack. 2 separate autopsies were done on the body, including one by the same doctor who had helped Putin get Sobchak out of Russia years prior, and a murder investigation would close after 3 months, with no findings reported. Journalists would later uncover that both of Sobchak's bodyguards were treated for minor symptoms of poisoning. That same journalist would have his car blown up in a garage apartment in an assassination attempt after he published a book offering a specific theory on how Sobchak would have been killed. But Sobchak's death was nowhere near sufficient to stop what was now less of an electoral campaign and more of a freight train. By now, there were no illusions about who would take first place in the elections. The only question remaining was whether Putin would win an absolute majority of votes or have to participate in a runoff. By then, operations in Chechnya were in their final phases. The capital city of Grozny had already fallen before Putin's assault, and Putin had made clear that he intended to pursue those Chechens who remained to the ends of the earth. Despite a horrific military campaign in which torture and indiscriminate killing of civilians were used by both sides, the international community had come to understand that their criticism wasn't helping anything, and moved instead to engage in dialogue with their new negotiating partner. American Secretary of State Madeleine Albright reported being pleasantly surprised with Putin's confidence and his preparedness, while leaders in Britain and France mellowed out their message on Putin's wartime strategy. Election day finally came on Sunday, March the 26th, 2000. With roughly 70% voter turnout across Russia, Putin cruised to a victory with a clean 53.4% of the vote. The runner-up, Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov, came in just a hair below 30%. The election was seen as being largely fair and free. At Putin's election headquarters, he was deferential rather than brash to quote, "Never in my worst nightmares did I imagine myself taking part in an election. Don't laugh. I'm serious. But at least, the way it was organized, I did not have to mislead vast numbers of people." Yeltsin called to congratulate him that night, and Putin refused his call. In the aftermath of Putin's election, the opposition leader we mentioned before, Marina Salye, would attempt to solicit support for a new political organization that would try and offer meaningful resistance to the Putin regime. To do that, she went to speak with an old ally, a politician named Sergei Yushchenkov. As writer Masha Gessen explained after an interview with Salye later in life, the visit to Yushchenkov scared Salye so much that even 10 years later, she refused to divulge the details. Gessen quotes Salye now, "I got there and there was a certain person in his office," she told me. "What kind of person?" "A certain person. We had a conversation that I wouldn't call constructive. I went home and told Natasha that I'm going to the country." Gessen says, "Did he threaten you?" The response, "No one directly threatened me." "So why did you decide to leave?" "Because I knew this person." "And what did seeing him mean?" "It meant that I should get as far away as possible." Salye would flee deep into the Russian countryside, where she'd die of a heart attack in 2012. The person she had intended to meet with, Yushchenkov, would be shot in the chest 4 times in 2002 after attempting to arrange political opposition to the Putin regime. The months before and after Putin's election were a critical moment for the new president, and one that would determine just what sort of leader he was going to be. Abroad, Putin worked to establish back channels with the West, hosting a visit with British Prime Minister Tony Blair even before Putin's election cycle had wrapped up. He parlayed that influence into a push towards a better relationship with the United States, an effort that did appear genuine at the time. Even the head of NATO paid a visit to Moscow, reopening a dialogue that had been non-existent since the violence in Kosovo. In an interview with the BBC, Putin even expressed openness to joining NATO. How things change. Although that proposal was regarded both then and now as a rather cheap opportunity to collect some political points, it was still an important signal. If Putin were publicly making statements as fanciful as that, then in private, he was likely to take a more cooperative tone than his international partners might have otherwise expected. In his new position, Putin's personality often clashed with the trappings of public life. He remained, as ever, a person who preferred not to indulge in displays of opulence, perhaps wearing a very expensive watch or a suit, but living in relatively humble accommodation and without many of the usual toys belonging to the rich and famous. But everywhere he went, gifts and donations would now shower upon him nonetheless. Everywhere he went, a presidential advance team ensured that Putin was shown signs of deference that he likely wouldn't have demanded himself, while regional governors and foreign hosts went to great lengths to impress him. He adjusted, of course, learning to live inside the pomp and circumstance of his daily affairs and allowing a bit more of a hubristic side to come out. But he remained, at times, almost boyish in the role. He seemed to forget his station when it came to greeting old friends or participating in debate and discussion with his domestic and foreign colleagues, even when the gap between their personal status and the Russian presidency was like a lion addressing a house cat. He looked past minor affronts that other world leaders would have considered cause for uproar, and was known for his restraint in discussions on sensitive topics, defending his position on, say, the war in Chechnya, but expressing his hostility through iciness rather than explosivity. Even a prominent critic of his, an economist named Andrei Eleranov, was asked several times to be Putin's economic advisor and eventually accepted the post. And in the early years of his presidency, he would run an annual phone-in program called Direct Line with Vladimir Putin, hearing and answering what were originally unfiltered, unscripted questions from real viewers across Russia. Yet even as Putin was running what was, most of the time, an effective public relations campaign, the early indicators of authoritarianism were still there to be found. In the first year of his presidency, Putin's focus was largely on centralization, bringing the media, the oligarch class, and the many disparate Russian oblasts or provinces back under the control of Moscow. The Yeltsin administration had gotten rid of a rule that had automatically renewed the broadcast licenses of television stations, and when a station ran a story suggesting that the FSB was responsible for the bombing attacks of Putin's acting president days, the new president oversaw a raid of that television station by armed, masked men who claimed to be special forces. That organization would later be brought under Russian state ownership. In other crackdowns, Putin kept himself intentionally aloof from legal prosecutions and investigations of media leaders, making himself mostly immune from attacks by what remained of the free press. Television stations and news outlets that didn't comply would find themselves pulled off the air, even amidst protests from many members of Russia's liberal elite, including Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. By 2003, Putin's Russia had gained unilateral control of all three of Russia's main TV channels. At the same time, Putin made sure to target prominent oligarchs as part of his crackdowns, broadcasting a signal loud and clear that Russia's rich and famous were expected to fall in line. But ever the shrewd manipulator, Putin held off prosecuting the oligarchs for what they'd done during the Wild West years of the Yeltsin administration. Instead, the new rules of the game went basically like this. Whatever the oligarchs had done and collected during the last decade, they would have at their disposal for the stage that came next. But the mad scramble for resources would have to stop. The state wouldn't confiscate any of what they collected, and the oligarchy would demonstrate its gratitude by not getting in the state's way. As Putin put it, in a meeting with 21 of the biggest businessmen in Russia, "You yourselves have created this situation to a large extent through political and quasi-political structures which you control. The last thing you should do is blame the mirror." But one oligarch who wasn't subject to those rules was Boris Berezovsky, the same man who had stuck by Yeltsin's side till the end, helped put Putin into office, and had proven himself unable to see the manipulations that Putin and Yeltsin had put him through. In fact, Berezovsky considered himself to be a main power broker in Russia, a kingmaker of sorts. As one of his business partners would later put, he really thought he had God by the beard and could walk on water. In private, Berezovsky continued to address Putin as an equal at best, or even at times as an underling. And in public, he openly opposed Putin's changes when he didn't like them. Most of all, he pushed back against Putin's efforts to bring his regional governors in line. Berezov felt that the move, which involved ending the governor's prosecutorial immunity, was dictatorial, and he said so in an open letter in a prominent newspaper. Putin felt that Berezovsky's display was a bridge too far. And when Putin told him to, Berezovsky flipped on a dime and began to arrange an opposition movement. That opposition would flounder for over a decade, and Berezovsky would end up living in exile in London for the rest of his life, enduring 2 alleged assassination attempts and dying under suspicious but inconclusive circumstances in London in 2013. Putin didn't deal with every challenge during these years with the same deftness that he showed against Berezovsky. In August of 2000, he fumbled a crisis in which Russia's largest nuclear attack submarine, the Kursk, was stranded on the seafloor with 119 souls on board. Russian rescuers thoroughly bungled their mission, and despite the presence of multiple other Russian warships when the Kursk was stranded, none had taken action to help. On the advice of his inner circle, Putin waited for days before consenting to foreign assistance, declined to show up on the scene of the incident, and instead spent his time with his wife and children at a resort in Sochi. All the while, the Russian and international press amplified the situation with the Kursk, mixing in images of Putin relaxing on the beach, seemingly entirely unbothered. All souls on board were publicly confirmed dead 1 week later, just hours after Putin had been informed about the public controversy and days too late to recover the damage to his image. But even in that moment, which in hindsight 2 decades later would be the most trying domestic PR nightmare of his entire presidency, Putin chose to deal with the situation as directly as he could. The tragedy would still haunt him for years abroad, but after he arranged and subjected himself to an hours-long meeting with the outraged families of the dead and insisted that their children would be taken care of, the Russian public largely forgave him. His domestic approval would rebound by December, and for years, Putin would never let a crisis go without his personal and immediate involvement. At that time, it was unprecedented for the Russian people to see a national leader assume personal accountability for things that went wrong, and the goodwill this would earn Putin with the public has buoyed him through even some of his darkest moments in the years since. When in 2002, a hostage crisis would trap 900 theatergoers, with several dozen Chechen gunmen and suicide bombers, and a carefully orchestrated rescue attempt went sideways and caused the deaths of 125, Putin was given credit for breaking the siege and killing the terrorists responsible, while avoiding blame for those who died needlessly in the botched rescue. Finally, Putin would extend another of his long-term personal rules to the presidency: never punish a potential enemy without giving them someplace to go. When Putin eventually identified the right military officials to hold accountable for the disaster aboard the Kursk, those who got fired were set up with jobs in the private sector that would see them through the rest of their working lives. When he forced the disbanding of a popular television channel, TV6, he allowed the journalists who had been fired to continue their work at a replacement channel, albeit one that was overseen by a businessman close to Putin. When he brought Russian television under his control, he left print media mostly untouched and made no effort to censor the internet, at least not yet. In every instance that Putin tightened his grip on Russia, he left avenues for relief, so that a person who risked becoming disenfranchised or disillusioned was instead given incentive to learn to live with the new order. I've got to emphasize here that this is roughly the point of Putin's story, that the abundance of death around him simply become too many to count. We'd like to catalogue every suspicious disappearance, name every dissident to perish under suspicious circumstances, or give a detailed view of the crises that dotted this period of Russian history. If you'd like to see a more focused episode on any of those events, do let us know in the comments, and we can cover that. The remaining years of Putin's first term were busy and violent. In Chechnya, his war had deteriorated into a low-grade conflict that mostly manifested itself via terror attacks in both the Caucasus and Moscow. Putin's chosen leader in Chechnya, Akhmat Kadyrov, would be killed in an explosion at an event that he had attended by chance, and the territory was passed down to his son Ramzan, who still rules Chechnya today. Now, we won't be taking an extended look at Ramzan Kadyrov in this video, but just to have a sense of what he's all about, it's widely suspected that for Putin's 54th birthday on October the 7th, 2006, Kadyrov may have had opposition journalist Anna Politkovskaya shot dead in her apartment block as a present. In the worst terror attack of these few years, nearly 800 schoolchildren and hundreds of parents and teachers would be taken hostage. When the siege broke 2 days later, 186 children, 149 adults, and 10 special forces officers died in a 6-hour firefight. Putin blamed the tragedy on the same root cause as the whole Chechen war, mistakes made by the Yeltsin administration, who had tried to work more collaboratively with Chechen fighters. The hostage crisis would be the last of its kind that Putin had to deal with, but not because of anything he might have done. Instead, the horror was so great that it turned the Chechen population and any sympathizers in the international community against the guerrilla fighters there. But it wasn't just the acts of the Chechen resistance that made all these years violent. All around Putin, his advisors and subordinates had picked up on how their boss liked to run things, staying aloof, not just so that he could appear detached from controversy, but so that when his allies did something he tacitly approved of but couldn't support in public, he could reprimand or outright condemn them. Behind the scenes, he'd then let them off with a wink and a slap on the wrist. When the hostage crisis at the school kicked off, Russian state media did what they knew would help the situation, and claimed that a few hundred hostages, not 1,000, had been taken. Journalists on state media began to self-censor, and then so did the printed press. Most of the oligarch class decided to keep their distance from politics, and those who didn't, most prominently a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, was made an example of to the rest. Internationally, Putin's first few years in office were defined largely by his complex relationship with the United States. He hadn't gotten long to work with the Clinton administration, and instead spent most of his time working with George Bush, who Putin deeply impressed at their first meeting by appealing to Bush's devout Christian beliefs. When the terror attacks of September 11, 2001 took place, Putin threw his full support behind Bush, despite the fact that prior intelligence he had attempted to offer the United States hadn't been taken seriously. Russia helped the United States acquire military bases in Central Asia, despite the fact that amounted to NATO encirclement of Russian territory. Finally, Putin made himself a critical partner during the American occupation in Afghanistan, while avoiding condemnation of America's invasion of Iraq, despite his knowledge that the Iraqi regime did not have weapons of mass destruction, as America claimed. But these decisions were no more charitable than Putin's decision to avoid internet censorship or to give private sector jobs to those he fired. Like those choices, Putin's preference to ally with the US was a pragmatic one. By appealing to Bush, who was considerably more malleable than most foreign leaders, Putin was able to avoid potentially troublesome standoffs about nuclear drawdown and missile defense systems. When disputes did take place, as they did when the US pulled out of a key missile defense treaty, the two nations were able to move past them, and other brawls were circumnavigated entirely. But Putin's relationship with NATO, well, that was another matter entirely. Putin had long been skeptical of NATO from his early days as Secretary of the Russian Security Council, although his position on the organization had matured, or perhaps soured, in the following years. Putin had not yet taken over for Yeltsin when NATO intervened without UN approval against the Serbian army during operations in Kosovo, but the event made a huge impact on him. Putin had taken NATO's actions as an act of war meant to modify borders in Europe while racking up casualties against a known Russian ally in Serbia, and after he settled on that interpretation, he never looked back. In the early days, Putin tried to integrate himself into NATO like he'd done with Bush, but that was a losing effort. Moving forward, Putin would avoid condemning the Bush administration, partly by using Bush's European partners as a punching bag before the press. When Putin accused foreign governments of aiding and abetting Chechen rebels, as he did in the wake of the school massacre, he did it without naming America directly, and instead going after the West, a term that included America, but also the rest of the NATO-allied world. And it wasn't as if Putin had much of an international coalition at his disposal. Instead, he had the so-called Commonwealth of Independent States, a stumbling, dysfunctional arrangement of post-Soviet nations that were geographically close to each other in the near abroad, as they were termed in Russian, but whose shared history often made them combative rather than cooperative. The nations Russia perceived as its buffers against NATO expansion, Belarus and Ukraine, were easy enough to deal with, but the Central Asian republics were difficult and often standoffish, all with different ideas about what they wanted to achieve in the post-Soviet era. Georgia in particular was a source of persistent frustration. In November 2003, the small mountain nation experienced its Rose Revolution when a military-backed popular revolt installed an opposition leader as president. The problem with their candidate, Mikhail Saakashvili, wasn't that he was pro-Western. Georgia's last leader had been too. But Saakashvili was clearly interested in drawing down Russian influence in his country, and we're going to circle back to that issue rather shortly. To deal with the many issues among those nations Russia considered friends, Putin had a few key strategies. In some, like Georgia, Moldova, or the always contentious nations of Armenia and Azerbaijan, he relied on Russian peacekeeping missions that were meant to protect the territorial integrity of breakaway provinces. Those provinces were, and still are, basically autonomous or otherwise politically separate from the nations they're technically part of, and having those breakaway provinces at Putin's disposal has repeatedly allowed him to stir the pot when it serves him. In other nations, he was forced to turn to appeasement. In Belarus, Putin seemed to decide it was best to grit his teeth and bear Alexander Lukashenko, while in Turkmenistan, he ordered the embassy to systematically ignore the injustices that some 120,000 Russian expats were suffering there. And in Ukraine, though conclusive proof has never emerged, Putin's FSB, or another Russian intelligence organization, is believed to have poisoned a popular opposition presidential candidate who wanted to bring Ukraine into NATO while funneling extraordinary amounts of money to his opponent. The opposition candidate won anyhow, and Putin took a black eye that he wouldn't forget. By now, Putin's rhetoric around the United States was beginning to change. Weeks after the Ukrainian elections resolved against Putin's wishes, Bush gave a speech for his own second inauguration, vowing that the United States would take upon itself to support rising democratic movements in every corner of the globe. It was a speech meant for an American audience, and one that got a very different reaction out of Putin than it probably intended, if, that is, the administration had factored Putin into the equation at all. To the Russian president, the speech came off as deeply hypocritical, both because it looked past the United States' long history of allying itself with undemocratic regimes, and because it was essentially a claim that the US could act in precisely the ways they'd gotten mad at Russia for doing. That was, of course, nothing new, but it was proof positive that Putin's suspicions were warranted. As he saw it, Bush had practically admitted that if he had been able to put his finger on the scale in Ukraine or in Georgia, then he would have. And if Bush was admitting outright that that's what the United States wanted to accomplish, then Putin would believe him. Now, by the time of Bush's second inaugural, Vladimir Putin was worlds away from the young man he'd been just 4 years prior, quaking in his boots as Boris Yeltsin placed the weight of the world on his shoulders. Though a rocky first few years, Putin had found his footing. He'd learned what worked, what didn't, and he'd worked his way through the many pitfalls and traps of leadership. So, as we pivot into Putin's second term, let's take a moment and take stock of the Russian leader as he was in, let's say, early 2005, around the time when he began to pivot from political disruptor to lifelong autocrat. Of the things that mattered to Putin around this time, perhaps none was so important as Russia's position on the global stage. Although some of the more hawkish Western political analysts of the time might have told it differently, Putin appears to not have been concerned with world domination, but he was absolutely concerned with the protection of Russia's sphere of influence. Just like the United States largely had a say over what happened in Europe, Latin America, and some parts of Asia, so too should Russia have that same say over Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East. Or at least, that's how the thinking went. At the top of Putin's mind was the Russian diaspora, the millions upon millions of ethnic Russians who had been living in nearby nations when the Soviet Union collapsed and now found themselves inside of nations that did not accept them as their own. In some places, like, say, Ukraine, this meant the Russian diaspora could be outvoted. In places like Latvia, it meant that they could be denied citizenship, and in places like Turkmenistan, it meant their businesses and estates could be stripped from them. While Western onlookers might have understood how these acts might have been difficult for the impacted Russian populations, the changes were still seen as smaller nations taking back control from a system that had spent decades disenfranchising them. But from Putin's perspective, so much of the political strife in his region could be traced back to the moment when the Russian diaspora had become disenfranchised expatriates abroad. He, like the rest of the Russian population, had lived for decades under a regime that had been able to stop these sorts of changes. And if stability was what Putin craved, then he could find potential fixes by simply looking back at the old Soviet state. One way Putin leveraged his authority over his neighbors was with gas supply. Russia's monolithic state-run supplier Gazprom had the ability to simply turn off the tap in Ukraine, Belarus, and even most of Europe in a power imbalance that we're all too familiar with today. In one example, Russia switched off the gas to Ukraine on the same day that it assumed the presidency of the then G8 group. At the same time, he began making grander and grander pronouncements on the political stage, speaking for his entire sphere of influence, even in moments where the leaders of nearby nations would have disagreed with what he said. He began taking a harsher and harsher line against dissidents, even ones living in the West, and when foreign governments realized they couldn't really even punish Putin for targeted attacks, he wasn't just emboldened. He now had proof positive that he already had the leverage he needed and would be able to act as a unilateral decision-maker for the post-Soviet world in the future. It was that same self-assuredness that would carry Putin through one of the defining sagas of his second presidential term, Georgia. The United States had decided that it would support Georgian President Saakashvili in reintegrating two breakaway regions on his territory, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and Putin had decided that he would stand firmly in opposition. For months, Putin escalated his rhetoric against the United States, now openly accusing the US of trying to lock down a unipolar world order. As Putin explained it to a global summit in Munich, he felt that Russia was being lectured about democracy, but for some reason, those who teach us do not want to learn themselves. The United States in turn regarded Putin's newfound bluntness as a thug-like attempt to beat the civilized world over the head, but whether or not that was true it led the US to overlook the basic message. Putin wasn't pushing for Russian dominance, nor a return to the Soviet era, nor even a major change to the world order at that time. Instead, he was pushing for multipolarity, in a structure that, at the time, would have consisted of the US and Russia, but that implicitly left room for major powers to enter or even leave the club as decades wore on. Indeed, Putin's NATO-bashing speeches weren't followed by Russian withdrawals from the international world, just the opposite. Russia continued its participation in the G8, kept working with the West on security issues, and even made a personal trip to visit the Bush family at their summer home. But all the while, mistrust continued to grow and fester between the two nations. Progress on nuclear issues stalled and then started to backslide, and the situation in Georgia continued edging towards a crisis. The next step in the breakdown came in early 2008. When Kosovo declared its independence and gained international recognition from the US and most of the EU. This was a bridge too far for Putin, who saw Kosovo's independence from Serbia as being no more legitimate than, say, Abkhazia's desire for independence from Georgia, which the same EU nations and the Americans had ignored. 4 days later, he met with Georgian President Saakashvili and gave him the message that no post-Soviet state wants to hear. You know, we have to answer the West on Kosovo. We are very sorry, but you are going to be a part of that answer. Putin explained that Abkhazia and South Ossetia would be getting far greater support from Russia moving forward. Saakashvili attempted to bargain, but Putin refused, asked Saakashvili to please not take what happened to him as a personal affront. And he finished with a warning. You think you can trust the Americans? Nobody can be trusted except me. I will do what I promise. And what Putin promised was that Russia would assert its authority in Georgia regardless of how the international community responded. It would be a clear and authoritative rebuke to NATO, a warning shot across the bow for states like Ukraine that might have thought they could entertain their own NATO bids, and a reaffirmation to the people of Russia and the post-Soviet nations that Putin, not the United States, was the one calling the shots. When word of Putin's intent was disseminated to Western leaders, very few voices took the threat seriously. The compromise attempts that came after were undone by stubbornness and ideological convictions on both sides, and finally, Putin came to the conclusion that his long pragmatic attempt to collaborate with the West had all been for naught. As prescribed by the Russian constitution, Putin was not allowed to serve a third consecutive term as president, but it was abundantly clear to all in Moscow and around the world that he had no intention of leaving. In fact, the Russian people probably wouldn't have minded him sticking around a while longer. During his previous 8 years in office, Russia's economy had recovered from its Yeltsin-era crashes, taxes had fallen to the lowest flat rate in Europe, and although police corruption and organized crime were still standing issues, violent crime had been reduced drastically. What the Russian people hadn't seen, the slow interweaving of deeply corrupt officials into all levels of the Russian government, and the way Putin had arranged the oligarchs and politicians into his own network, well, what the people didn't know wouldn't hurt them. A whole lot of ordinary Russians had been hurt during the Putin years, or had seen their personal situation decline, but on balance, Putin would have faced very little backlash if he'd chosen to break the rules. Instead, he opted to maneuver yet again, this time by elevating one of his most trusted deputies to the presidency in his stead. His replacement was Dmitry Medvedev, a career politician who had met Putin in their days in Leningrad under Anatoly Sobchak. He'd gotten rich off a lumber company in the 1990s and had been handpicked by Putin in late 1999 after Putin became premier to help govern in Moscow. He later spent years as the chairman of Gazprom's board of directors while working double duty as Putin's chief of staff for a bit over 2 years, and immediately after that as first deputy prime minister. Medvedev waltzed through the electoral season once he gained Putin's endorsement, and with no sign that any political backlash was coming, he announced his plan for what would come next. If Russia elected Medvedev, as the nation seemed firmly on course to do, then Medvedev would declare Putin prime minister. It was an obvious trick to get around the constitution. Once Putin was PM, it would be easy to formally or informally shift the balance of power between the premiership and the presidency. But obvious or not, the Russian public went for it, providing Medvedev just over 70% of the overall vote. Of course, what Medvedev wouldn't have told the world is that most of the world did not consider those elections to be free or fair. Medvedev received wall-to-wall media coverage during the election season, and candidate registration had a whole mess of issues. There were even allegations that the final numbers were fudged by electoral commissions. Unfortunately for the voters, though, none of that mattered. When Putin stepped down the premiership, he refused to take legal action to modify the powers of the prime minister or of the president as they related to each other. Apparently, he trusted the understanding he'd formed with Medvedev, or otherwise knew he could wrestle back control if Medvedev started growing his own ambitions. Putin also became chairman of the United Russia political party, indicating that he fully intended to continue shaping Russia's political future far past the years that he and Medvedev would share power. With the transition came fewer obligations, foreign travel and diplomatic photo ops, less scrutiny as to Putin's daily activities, and greater leeway to work with and leverage a wide range of politicians and businessmen who it had to keep at arm's length while president. Medvedev would have to carry out an unpleasant task on Putin's behalf, the invasion of Georgia, which kicked off just a few months after Medvedev was inaugurated. Putin had kept his promise to Saakashvili that Georgia would be made an example, and with a new figurehead to carry out that retribution for him, Putin's personal culpability for the invasion was certainly still recognized, but Medvedev was the fall guy, and fall he would. When the invasion kicked off on August 2, 2008, Putin was in Beijing, sitting beside dozens of other world leaders at the opening ceremonies for the Olympics. On the Georgian border, Saakashvili had been baited into launching an attack on his breakaway province, where Russian troops waited in full force to conduct a vastly disappropriate counter-invasion. But Saakashvili's miscalculation ensured that Russia could hide under the pretext of a defensive response. But although Putin was now insulated from the worst of the condemnations for having started the conflict, it was he, not Medvedev, who would travel to Russia's border regions to manage the crisis permanently. Washington was out of the picture, Europe was nowhere to be found, and with very little to stop him, Putin set to work playing God in his own corner of the world. Russian bombers and helicopters laid waste to the Georgian defense, enabling a lightning attack that brought Georgia to the brink within 3 days and nights. Making public remarks about his decision to push into sovereign Georgia after the fact, Putin said, "Why did we act as we did? Because the infrastructure they used to attack Shikanvali, the control centers, radars, and arms dumps were in Georgia itself. I hear about disproportionate use of force when they use tanks, rockets, and heavy artillery against us. Should we respond by using catapults?" The quote ends. All this, again, framing Russia's counter-invasion as a proportional and direct response to Saakashvili's attack, despite the broader context illustrating how it was anything but. Eventually, Russia withdrew and left Georgia its sovereignty. After all, Georgia was hardly relevant in the first place. Putin had gotten precisely what he was after and sent a clear warning shot across the entire world's bow. 2 weeks after the ceasefire was signed, Medvedev would do his part to add insult to injury, recognizing the Georgian territories of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as sovereign nations. Putin, meanwhile, accused Georgia of ethnic cleansing in Ossetia, leveling the same charges that NATO had done against the Serbs years prior. The tit-for-tat over Kosovo was finally completed, and Putin had illustrated quite clearly how Russia would react to future Western attempts to change the international order. Even 15 years ago, Putin was setting the table for a situation that bears strong resemblance to the Eastern Europe of today. With the new status quo established, Putin would pull strings behind the scenes as Medvedev negotiated the New START treaty and collaborated with the Americans on Iran and convinced the Obama administration to agree that Georgia and Ukraine would be left out of NATO for many years to come. Russia was admitted to the World Trade Organization and other global bodies, while at home press freedoms were curtailed further and Putin's rivals in the oligarchy were reined in. Putin distinguished himself with grandiose smackdowns of Russian elites who were accused of, in some way or another, screwing the Russian people, and he made a show of rubbing elbows with global superstars at charity events and other high-profile gatherings. All the while, Medvedev was the punching bag for anything the West, the Russian elite, or the people didn't like. And he provided a nice veneer of legitimacy when he extended Russia's presidential terms to 6 rather than 4 years, a decision that would benefit exactly one person in the future. By this time, Putin had bid farewell to many of the people who had been important to him early in his political career. He and his wife had separated sometime around 2005, and by that time his daughters had grown up and left home. Publicly, he'd become flirtatious with young women around him, especially blondes, and he has long been suspected of having an intimate relationship with Alina Kabayeva, a 2-time Olympic medalist who was just 22 when she began to be associated with Putin, 31 years her elder. Since she had her own political career, and she's alleged to still be coupled with Putin, with widespread suspicion that the pair have several secret children. Outside his romantic life, Putin has seen many of his old friends from the KGB days either retire, move into the private sector, or in some cases become alienated from him, and external onlookers have consistently noted that when many of those older faces left, they weren't replaced by people who seemed to have Putin's trust in the same way. It was during these years that the Putin personality cult really began taking off. Now, Putin-themed shirts, calendars, and other merchandise merchandise had been popular in Russia since he first gained the presidency. At the time, he had reacted to it with the shyness that he was known for in his early days, perhaps deflecting it with a little bit of humor as well. But by the end of his second presidential term, he had long since learned the value of shaping public opinion and leaned fully into the messages of strength and virility that the Russian people seemed to want. This is about the time that Putin began, say, posing shirtless on horses, or posing shirtless feeding horses, or posing shirtless on boats, or posing shirtless while on the water, or, well, you get the idea. He was always shirtless. His judo skills were increasingly put on display. He began taking well-publicized hunting trips. He staged an incident where he was supposed to have stumbled upon immensely valuable historical artifacts while swimming, and in 2011, he even performed dentistry on one of his provincial governors. During his second premiership, one religious sect even proselytized that Putin was the reincarnation of St. Paul. But if these few fleeting years as prime minister were the happy ones, then for Putin, they were over too soon. Before long, it was time to consider whether Medvedev would stand for a second term or whether Putin would return to the presidency now that he'd taken his mandated one-term break. Medvedev had begun to overextend, making speeches calling for a political shift toward liberalism and failing to use Russia's veto on a UN Security Council resolution to approve a NATO-led intervention against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. That later offense was a mortal one for Putin, who saw the intervention not as an attempt to protect civilians, but as an attempt to do again what the West had done in the Balkans and in Iraq. When Medvedev had the option to reconcile with Putin, he instead stuck to his guns, and thus he sealed his own fate. As Putin is reported to have said to his own aides in private, "Don't worry, come September, we'll do what we have to do, and everyone will breathe a sigh of relief." And breathe they would. In September, Medvedev would announce that he would return to party affairs and Putin would return to the presidency. In a classic Putin move that should be all too familiar by now, the man who'd become inconvenient for him wasn't fired, but shifted to a lesser role. Enter Prime Minister Medvedev, who swapped places with Putin in a move that looked as if it was always meant to happen. Now, the news wasn't received well. Russia was a lot more worldly in 2011 than it had been in 2007, and the internet was still mostly unrestricted. A middle class was developing and was willing to take to the streets in protest rather than lose what it had going. In fact, it was around this time that the Russian population really began to chafe under Putin, and that a formerly unknown anti-corruption activist named Alexei Navalny started speaking out against Putin, setting himself on a path that would see him rival the 21st century Tsar directly in due time. But it wouldn't matter. Putin's United Russia Party gained a clear plurality in a highly questionable 2011 election, and Putin was able to slide himself back into the presidency without starting a popular uprising. To do it, he placated the protesters, showing them on television and allowing state TV to repeat claims that the election was rigged. But with their claims heard, the middle class seemed to give Putin just enough leeway that the protest movement fell away. When the time for the presidential election came, Putin ran away with 63% of the vote versus 17% for the best runner-up. During Putin's third inaugural speech, observers in the crowd were stunned to notice something they'd hardly ever seen before: tears rolling down their leader's cheeks, not due to the cold weather during his outdoor address, but most likely from one part relief and one part a sense of destiny. As author Philip Short, whose biography on Putin was instrumental in writing this episode, had put it, after 12 years in power, Putin had come to see himself as the incarnation of the state. It is a view that has been shared by all manner of world leaders throughout history, but one that tends to coincide, more often than not, with despots, dictators, autocrats, and supreme leaders. We know it in hindsight. The Russian elections of 2012 were the last chance to oppose Putin in any meaningful way, and those who had sought to oppose him were unsuccessful. It's at about this time that we're going to want a full understanding of two key concepts: Putinism and Ruski Mir. First, Putinism. And if that phrase sounds reminiscent of Stalinism, well, that's the point. Political Putinism is, well, all of it. The socio-economic and political system that Putin has worked so hard to develop. It's the way modern Russia works. And if we understand it now, it'll be much easier for our listeners hearing this story from inside global democracies and republics to understand just how alien the Russia of today has become. At Putinism's core is the idea that power is concentrated in the hands of a select few, and that wielding power isn't a question of exercising the people's will, but of managing an organization. The people who run the government are the people who the leader, in this case Putin, trusts. Over the span of years or decades, those trusted individuals climb higher and higher, accumulate more and more wealth, and bring in their own trusted affiliates, who by association are trusted by the leader too. As their power concentrates, they gain control over different sectors of society: business, finance, media, agriculture, that sort of thing. They become oligarchs. Very rich people whose fates are intertwined with those of the state itself. At the same time, the public is discouraged from involvement in politics, with political leadership and the oligarch class perceived not as overlords, but as managers in the same way that you might hire a financial advisor to manage your wealth. In exchange for the abridgment of some democratic freedoms and the sacrifice of some human rights, ordinary people get a good deal of personal freedom, and in an ideal world, they are able to enrich themselves under Putin's system. Take a broader look at the way Putin seemed to perceive the world, and we find Putinism's key word: stability. Putinism is a deeply conservative ideology, one that seeks to maintain the status quo for just about everybody so that the select few occupants of the managerial class can improve everybody's lot bit by bit. Just like NATO's attempts to effect regime change are viewed as inherently destabilizing, so too are things like peaceful protest or political opposition or changes in cultural norms. The question isn't whether these changes are right or wrong. Change itself is the enemy. In a way, Putinism doesn't even include the idea of a grander, globally dominant Russia because it doesn't envision a different future at all. That's not the point. The point is that the future should look very much like the present, except a little bit better from year to year. And then there's the other side of the coin, Ruski Mir, or translated to English, the Russian world. Alongside political Putinism, Ruski Mir is a vision of Russia that extends beyond its current borders to a wider Russian civilization that exists separate from the global West or East. Ruski Mir extends to Ukraine, it extends to Georgia, it extends to much of the territory that once called itself the Soviet Union, and it extends to the Russian diaspora, for which Putin's Russia considers itself a benevolent imperial force. With Ruski Mir comes Russian nationalism, Russian exceptionalism, anti-Westernism, and the idea that Russia, no matter how managerial or bureaucratic it might be, is and always has been a great global power. It's an ideology that breeds extremism all up and down the Russian social ladder, and one that has in the present day metastasized outward to a desire to unite the global Russian people into one state. As the rest of our story brings us towards the Russia of today, it's Putinism and the Ruski Mir that are going to make everything make sense. But just as important as the grand ideologies of modern Russia are the realities of day-to-day life in the Russian state, how the nation governs itself, and how Putin's inner circle actually keeps itself afloat. As should be more than clear by now, Putin has been more than willing to allow the oligarch class to continue accumulating its wealth, as long as they stay out of politics. But there was another element of that deal that we haven't yet discussed. If an oligarchy wants to conduct some especially shady business, then they're tacitly expected to make up for it in some way, whether it's a personal contribution to Putin himself or some sort of benefit or program that can go to the state. If, say, an oligarch who works in shipping wants to ignore some rules around export controls, then that's all well and good. But they'd better fill in the potholes in Siberia while they're at it. And of course, Putin is going to want to stay in the most elaborate mansion next week when he goes on vacation. Meanwhile, some of the money they provide to fill potholes will be siphoned away and added to what some experts allege is a massive slush fund shared between Putin and the rest of his ex-KGB inner circle within the oligarchy. It's in this quiet exchange that Putin has managed to keep his oligarch class quiet and largely happy, while he himself has managed to maintain a public image as a humble public servant. On paper, Putin doesn't own very much. He earns a salary equivalent to $140,000 per year, he's got an 800 square foot apartment and a couple of cars, and that's about it. But in reality, Putin controls vast sums of money, so vast in fact that in 2017, an American financier speaking to the US Senate Judiciary Committee claimed that he was the richest man in the world at that time with some $200 billion to his name. He's believed to have a gargantuan mansion on the Black Sea, well over a dozen homes, hundreds of cars, dozens of aircraft, and a mega yacht. As far as international finance experts can tell, those assets are almost fully held under the names of Putin's allies. Much like Putin has kept a tight grip on his subordinates without relying on messy public firings, he's been able to control a vast sum of wealth without really holding it in his hand. What that means is that Putin enjoys his wealth at the pleasure of his partners in leadership. And it's this trade-off that has made Putin so effective in his role for decades. Although it puts Putin himself in a somewhat riskier position, his arrangement with the oligarch class means that everyone's got to keep their end of the bargain. Putin will punish them for interference in his affairs, but if he interferes too much in the affairs of the oligarchy, they're at liberty to hang him out to dry. If, for example, too many people among the Russian mega-rich decide they're sick of Putin, they can band together and take away his riches with a snap of a finger. If just one of them goes rogue, all the others will stand by while Putin deals with the disturbance. In a way, it's Russia's internal version of Cold War-era mutually assured destruction. If one side goes down, the other side is coming down with it. When it comes to Putin's public statements, especially against the West, one core message has always been his most successful. The argument that Russia's detractors around the world are hypocrites, ignoring or lying about their own questionable behaviors, even as they accuse Russia of the same. Early in Putin's presidency, and in his various roles in the 1990s, that made a bit more sense. Russia was a geopolitical question mark on the world stage, and a lot of international leaders responded by demagoguing a situation that they didn't fully understand. But as time has gone on, and Putin has become more closed off in his role, those arguments have gotten thinner and thinner in ways that Putin doesn't seem to realize. He'll cherry-pick instances in which American journalists lost their jobs for political reasons to justify a campaign of press restrictions in his own country, or write off his own repression of opposition parties by claiming that Western nations do the same. Increasingly, he's repeated fabrications that have proven to be quite obviously false and has appeared to source information more and more exclusively from his own inner circle. Simultaneously, Putin has long attested in public to the gradual shortening of the list of people he trusts, becoming more isolated as new faces prove able to replace the people he decides to leave behind. With that lack of moderating voices comes a greater willingness to go down the rabbit hole until the reality that someone in Putin's position would recognize may bear little resemblance to the one shared by the rest of us. When Putin returned to the presidency in 2012, he was still reeling from an acute sting of betrayal from the nascent Russian middle class. These were people who arguably had benefited most from Putin's rule. They weren't rich, but they had far better lives in a far better Russia than their parents ever had. And now they'd turned on Putin like a bunch of ungrateful children. In his second official administration, the Russian middle class would feature far less prominently in the plans of Putin's regime, and if they ceased to exist in totality, well, then Putin didn't really seem to mind. Instead, his focus would shift to the lower class workers across Russia, who had been a large part of Putin's electoral victory. They were happy to accept Putin's contract, endure some abridgments of their personal and political rights in exchange for minimal government involvement in their own affairs. With Putin's tacit support, police became quite a bit more eager to brawl with middle-class protesters, and prominent blue-collar workers were brought into the administration directly. Famous protest leaders, previously thought untouchable, were bogged down with investigations into their finances, and non-governmental organizations that accepted foreign donations were made to register as foreign agents, basically spies. Most famous of all, Putin would begin his long war against the members of a band and performance art group called Pussy Riot, 3 of whom were imprisoned for 2 years' time after a demonstration outside a Russian Orthodox cathedral not far from the Kremlin. But the man who caught the worst of it was Alexei Navalny, who was slammed with large-scale fraud charges just 1 day after the Pussy Riot trials began. Navalny was, by that point, the closest thing to real opposition that Putin had to worry about, and naturally, that was Putin's cue to make an example of his rival. Navalny would spend months under house arrest, facing a growing mountain of charges, and eventually he'd be sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Even more stunning is what the Russian legal system did with him next. They freed him a few months ahead of the Russian Winter Olympics in Sochi and allowed him to run openly against the incumbent in Moscow's mayoral election, and then let him lose with just barely a quarter of the overall vote in what had been a free and fair election, but one where the incumbent had a massive advantage. In the coming years, his legal issues would hang over his head and be used frequently to dissuade or bar him from registering in elections, but for a while, Navalny himself remained a free man. Abroad, this is about the time that Russia began to throw its weight around more and more enthusiastically. In 2012, Russia began taking measures to prop up the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, escalating in 2013 when Russia not only refused to respond to repeated use of chemical weapons by the regime, but ran political interference with American President Obama to ensure that the US would not intervene militarily. Syrian chemical weapons had long been regarded as Obama's red line that, if crossed, would demand a military response. But in practice, it was less a red line and more a bright red wire that Putin would cut while defusing a much larger geopolitical bomb. In those same years, Putin would slam America repeatedly for the use of torture, and his rhetoric began framing his fellow major power as not just hypocritical, but ruthlessly violent. American officials began to be banned from travel to the country, and Americans were prohibited from adopting Russian children. These same years also saw Putin welcome one Edward Snowden to Russia, essentially as a giant middle finger to the United States. Back in Russia, Putin's noose continued to tighten. Defamation and libel were made into criminal offenses rather than civil ones, and independent television channels that had started under Medvedev were banned. Russian authorities began shutting off access to a range of websites, and bloggers were made to enter a government registry. As his specific brand of populist appeal began to emphasize the role of tradition and the Orthodox Church in the lives of ordinary Russians, Russia's LGBT population were placed directly into the crosshairs, deliberately targeted both by political action and ordinary citizens. This situation has only gotten worse and worse as the years have drawn on, in sharp contrast from Putin's early, rather open-minded treatment of gay people that he'd worked with. Now, with Russian religious conservatism in need of an enemy that looked nothing like the Russian state, well, they were it. As that demagoguing began, recognition of the darker elements of Soviet history began to cease, written out of new history textbooks in favor of grandiose exaltations of Russian glory. Russia's opportunity to host the Sochi Olympics of 2014 passed mostly without incident, except for one tiny little sticking point remembered today as the annexation of Crimea. Again, Russia waited to take action until the government of the nation where he intended to intervene had given him enough pretext to appear as if Putin himself had been attacked. This time it wasn't a preemptive attack on a pro-Russian enclave, but a political crisis that saw Putin's ally, Ukrainian then-President Viktor Yanukovych, flee to Moscow amidst a popular uprising and the deaths of dozens of protesters. That, according to Putin and his inner circle, presented a brief opportunity to strike. The operation was hastily planned and led by a new, virtually unknown Minister of Defense who's since made a major impact, Sergei Shoigu. Despite Shoigu's initial objections to the proposed operation, massive Russian forces were moved to the Ukrainian border, and paratroopers wearing unmarked green uniforms infiltrated Crimea on the eve of the Olympics closing ceremony. Within days, they'd seized Crimea's political infrastructure, removing the current leaders and plugging in a shadowy figurehead of Putin's choice. Ukraine's 22,000 troops in Crimea made no attempt to resist, and the Russian paratroopers were able to lock down full control within a week. The West responded with sanctions, but nothing more. And with that, it was decided. Crimea belonged to Vladimir Putin. A few weeks later, the Russian-speaking population of Crimea voted nearly unanimously to join Russia, and the affair was complete. Ukraine was effectively put off from joining NATO. Putin had pleased the traditionalists in Russia who had seen Crimea as rightfully Russian, and the West yet again heard a familiar line from Putin that his actions in Crimea were the same as what the West had done in Kosovo. At home, Putin's operation had been a resounding hit. His approval ratings shot up to over 80%. The airwaves were saturated with praise for Russia's strength and power, and much of Putin's past conduct was forgiven. NATO was clearly disinterested in taking on Ukraine, a potential member whose territory was actively in dispute. Internationally, the message was precisely as Putin hoped. All the blustering rhetoric of the West, all the disdain for his actions, and all the condemnation of this new aggressive Russia didn't matter for anything, as long as the international community didn't have the guts to intervene. Putin had established the idea that his corner of the world was under his sole dominion as a major power. But the opportunity to push the envelope came a bit earlier than even Putin might have wanted. Ukraine is anything but homogenous, with a large Russian-speaking population in the eastern regions that was eager to take advantage of the Crimean affair. Within a few days after annexation, pro-Russian separatist militias had taken up arms across Ukraine's east, particularly in the Donbass region, and more specifically two provinces called Donetsk and Luhansk. Whether Putin, the FSB, or anybody else in Russia might have had a hand in the separatist movement's early days has never been firmly established, but we've got to emphasize here that these are communities that were genuinely willing and eager to separate themselves from Kiev. At first, Putin only approved limited aid to the militias, and despite their clear preference to live under Russian rule, the separatists still burned Putin in return. Before long, they'd held referendums on declaring their own independence against Putin's express wishes. Perhaps hoping to make the battlefront more dependent on Putin's own loyalists, the Donbass was soon flooded with Russian military veterans, Chechen militiamen, and members of an active Russian army division who were supposedly on leave from their duties in Crimea. With them came more weapons, more money, and even tactical leadership from the Russian MOD. But if Putin thought that those forces would be a stabilizing influence, he was wrong, and if he thought that the separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk had backstabbed him with their independence votes, then he must have gone apoplectic for what happened next. On July 17, 2014, a Russian-supplied mobile surface-to-air missile system was used to shoot down what the Donetsk People's Republic had thought was a Ukrainian Antonov 26 transport aircraft. In reality, it was Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, a civilian airliner carrying 283 passengers and 15 crew. All were civilians, and none would survive the missile strike. Before long, Western intelligence had established the source, a buck launcher from the Russian 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, which had been spotted in a wheat field in the immediate vicinity of the missile strike and seen later that same day with one of its 4 missiles clearly missing. The implications were devastating either way. Option 1, Russian forces had just shot down a civilian airliner, and Option 2, Russian forces had handed their advanced heavy weapons over to separatist forces with quite literally zero oversight. The seal was broken, and Russia's posture of operational deniability in the Donbass was not only gone, but unrecoverable. Putin's denials fell on deaf ears, and when he finally appeared in public days later, he appeared as if he hadn't slept since the incident took place. The excuses he offered were entirely insufficient, but, well, any excuse would have been. In hindsight, that is what we here at Warographics would pinpoint as the moment. That single defining act that took previously avoidable prospects like Russian isolation and full-scale war in Ukraine and made them inevitable. 3 things at this stage had immediately been clarified all at once. First, that the global West was no longer interested in tolerating Putin's political games or his attempts at plausible deniability. Second, that despite their disgust, the West couldn't or wouldn't intervene on Putin's own doorstep. And third, that Putin and his forces were deeply enmeshed in an escalating conflict in Ukraine. If any of those 3 fundamental realities could be changed, then there was hope. But otherwise, the dominoes would fall toward major war. It's at this moment that Vladimir Putin set foot on the path that he's on now, leading Russia into the shadows as the leader of a pariah state. If Russia really did intend to go its own way for the long run, then it would take a balancing act. Detangling fully from the international order was all but impossible for such a globalized nation, and if Russia made it look like they wanted a geopolitical free-for-all, then they risked that NATO might call their bluff and throw out the rulebook. But at the same time, Putin's growing isolation brought him friends as well as enemies. Now it was far easier to work collaboratively with nations that were previously considered either beneath Russia's stead or unsavory to Russia's Western partners. And Putin could not work just with states, but non-state actors, and particularly the separatist militias in the Donbass who had gotten him into this whole mess in the first place. Those militias needed help if they were going to survive. Ukraine had decided to put a stop to the violence with one major military push, and one that seemed as if it would be more than enough to win. But if Putin's deniability was gone anyhow, then there was no reason to play nice with Ukraine anymore. A week after the MH17 disaster, Russian armored columns advanced on Ukrainian positions, and before long the Ukrainian push was not just stymied, it was beaten back. With Russia now entering the conflict in full force and the West unwilling to intervene, Ukraine saw the writing on the wall. The best they could hope for now was containment of the separatists. Try and push Russia into their territory, and Russia would push them out. We won't return to a discussion of the Ukraine conflict for a few more minutes, because the status quo that was established by the end of summer 2014 would hold mostly constant for the next 8 years. Despite frequent skirmishes, Ukraine's eastern battle lines would remain all but unchanged, as combatants on both sides tried to make incremental gains while picking up experience that would serve them in the war to come. Meanwhile, Ukraine would have no hope of joining NATO. But Ukraine wasn't the only sovereign nation to get a close look at Russia's new wartime approach. In Syria, the popular uprising against Russia's ally Bashar al-Assad had developed into a chaotic, almost schizophrenic war with dozens of independent fighting factions whose allegiances and blood feuds morphed constantly. The West, and particularly the United States, had struggled to make meaningful change while navigating all the nuances of the conflict. But Putin took a very different approach. By his publicly stated logic, the Assad government was the only option to contain the chaotic elements in Syria, including the Islamic State. Putin did away with nuance in his approach to the conflict. Either a force was for the Assad government or against it, and militarily they'd be treated as such. In Syria, Russian forces on the ground surged against ISIS positions alongside a crippling air campaign that all but leveled cities like Aleppo at an unbelievable cost to civilian life. As they did, Putin railed against the West while dismissing the Russian military's own actions, claiming that Western recklessness in Iraq and Libya had caused the crisis, and that now he had to make tough decisions in order to clean up NATO's mess. When hostilities nearly spiraled out of control between Russia and NATO ally Turkey over a downed Russian warplane and their differing positions on Kurdish forces, Putin used the crisis to expose Turkey's complicity in receiving oil from the Islamic State, propping the organization up with what was essentially NATO money. The West stood by and watched, and Putin again played the bigger man, opting to retaliate economically and not militarily. When Turkish President Erdogan eventually came to kiss Putin's ring and make amends, the resulting arrangement would place Erdogan under Putin's sway. Through Erdogan, Putin would be able to subtly or not so subtly influence NATO, while Russia remained outside of NATO's grasp. Within just a couple of years, Putin had managed to pivot Russia entirely away from the West, making it into a true rival hegemon rather than a petulant child with nuclear weapons. Its geopolitical allies were generally hostile to the United States and vice versa. Its military, its media, and even its cyber capabilities had a global reach, and its finances were no more deeply dependent on the West than the West's economy was on Russia. Perhaps it should have been obvious by that point that the next step would have been to try and influence the United States. But when Putin's cyber intelligence apparatus hacked into the 2016 campaign of Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton and released thousands of her emails, it wasn't taken how Putin might have meant it. An instance in which another nation was doing to America what America did to other nations. Nor was it interpreted as a personal matter between a Russian president and a former US Secretary of State who had made no secret of her standoffishness in the past. Instead, it was seen as an unforgivable slight, one that drove the two nations even further apart for the years to come. The introduction of a new president, Donald Trump, didn't do much to change the situation. American perceptions that Russia had attempted to install Trump would prove difficult to shake, and Trump himself ended up being less of a partner for Putin and more of a political tool. Of course, that tool was helpful by itself, but Trump's influence was not nearly enough to undo the backsliding in relations between Russia and its biggest global rival. In fact, by now, Putin's experience with several American presidents had convinced him that the man in the top job couldn't do much to change the tides. As he said in one interview, "I've already dealt with 4 American presidents. They come and go, but the politics remain the same. When a person is elected, they may have some new ideas, but then the people with the briefcases arrive and instantly everything changes. It happens with every administration." The quote ends. Instead, Putin thrived off the chaos the Trump administration brought into American foreign policy. Over these few years, Putin and Russia gained quite a bit of ground on the US in international relations, while public perception in the US was divided on whether Trump himself could have been directly compromised by Putin's FSB. On the one hand, the Russian meddling fever that gripped the United States through the Trump years was a genuine barrier to foreign policy. On the other, it created the perception that even America's highest office could become subservient to Putin's will, further elevating Putin not as an entirely benevolent figure, but a deeply meaningful one on the world stage. Putin was typecast into supervillain status, a label that provided real and tangible street cred for Russia around the world. Yet both of the major arms control breakdowns that happened during the Trump years were done on the American side, not the Russian, while the end of the New START treaty in 2021 was a mutual action by both sides. By the end of the Trump presidency, Putin seemed to believe that it had undone the stagnation and diplomatic folly of the post-Soviet years. Russia had its own mission, its own orientations, and its own military capabilities apart from the West, with no reason to kowtow to Washington, Brussels, or anywhere else. The United States had, in Putin's view, pissed away the advantages of a unipolar world while Putin had rallied his ailing nation. He stopped trusting the West to act outside of its own self-interest, and he released himself and his nation from the obligation to act for any reason outside their self-interest. Putin may well have agreed that this new order was crueler, less forgiving, more prone to eruptions, but at least it was crystal clear to all parties involved, finally, what their shared set of rules would be. As we emerge into the territory of the present day, we've got to address one of the key factors that we haven't accounted for yet: Vladimir Putin's descent into outlandish and at times disconnected orientation that he's taken toward the world today. It's this shift that marks Putin's transition into what will likely be his final iteration, Russia's president for life. And like many such kings, emperors, and lifelong rulers who preside over an isolated place, the turn from the 2010s into the 2020s is when Putin's world began to shrink. The problem stems from Putin's global position. On the one hand, he has disconnected his peers on the world stage, the EU, the US, China, etc. And on the other, he's replaced those relationships with those of client states. Those smaller nations are deeply disincentivized from saying or doing anything that might piss Putin off, even just by contradicting his will. Domestically, Putin's stranglehold on the political opposition has meant that very few opposing voices can rise to the top, and the slow winnowing away of loyal followers who he personally trusts has created a situation where fewer and fewer people overall can say that they truly have the Tsar's ear. From Putin's vantage point inside Moscow's bubble, reality can get more than a little bit distorted. So let's introduce the gang. Well, we'll start with one Alexander Dugin. Sometimes referred to as Putin's philosopher, Dugin is a Russian ultranationalist who's been part of Putin's inner circle for a few years. He's the primary voice pushing the idea that a distinct Russian civilization is destined to rule across Eurasia. Then there's Nikolai Patrushev, whose relationship with Putin goes back to their early days in the KGB in the 1970s. Today, he's the Secretary of the Security Council of Russia, a leading architect of the invasion of Ukraine, and a vocal believer that the West's ultimate intent is to destroy all of Russia. Igor Sechin also wields strong influence over Putin to the point that he's been called, at times, Russia's second most important person. He leads the state-owned oil company Rosneft, and he and Putin go way back. The brothers Boris and Arkady Rotenberg were once Putin's judo partners. Now they're the richest family in Russia. And Alexander Bortnikov, whose relationship with Putin goes back to the Leningrad KGB, now runs the FSB, not necessarily guiding Putin on policy, but informing many of his most critical decisions. This small handful of men, along with a few others, are the primary voices Putin hears on a daily basis, and their influence on him simply can't be overstated. In 2018, Putin was elected to his fourth term as Russia's president, sweeping 77% of the overall vote. Regardless of the ballot stuffing and voter intimidation that took place, the result would have been the same anyhow. Putin, riding a wave of nationalism, when with nary a political opponent in sight, would be quite happily tolerated by the Russian people. But this time, there was a caveat. By Russian law, Putin's fourth term would have to be his last, until he changed the law, obviously. In Russia, the last several years have comprised more crackdowns, more targeting of the political opposition, and more empowerment of police forces loyal to the Kremlin. Individual journalists were placed on registries of foreign agents, and hundreds of potentially problematic organizations were added to lists of undesirables. Longtime opposition leader Alexander Navalny was poisoned with a nerve agent while on a flight from Siberia to Moscow, and when he survived the attack and chose to return to Russia from where he'd been treated in Germany, he was arrested immediately and sent to a penal colony. But it was in foreign affairs where Putin has really stepped things up. In the US, Joe Biden was inaugurated into office in 2021, and while Biden too fell into Putin's old adage about American presidents being guided by government men with briefcases, this time was different. They had known each other well in Biden's days as vice president. In the early days of his presidency, Biden had recalled telling Putin years ago, "When I look into your eyes, I don't think you have a soul." He also recalled Putin's response, "We understand each other." Putin and Biden's concurrent terms would keep that same energy for the first year or so, blisteringly aware of each other, but able to assess each other's motives and intentions clearly while getting real business done. That was, after all, the arrangement Putin had hoped to create by establishing Russia as a solitary, self-interested major power. But all this early diplomacy had a hidden dark side, as Putin laid the groundwork for, and then attempted to pull off, what has been the defining act of his fourth term: Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. When it came time to make that decision, standing alone in full view of the world, the rationale Putin presented for his choice was telling, but perhaps not for the reasons he believed. According to his pronouncements on the 24th of February 2022, Russia had embarked on its so-called special military operation not to just demilitarize Ukraine, but to denazify it. In the tale Putin spun, Russians in Ukraine had spent 8 years weathering genocide from the Ukrainian state, who justified their actions using Nazi ideology. The claim was outright false. Despite the presence of neo-Nazi and other far-right elements inside Ukraine's defense apparatus, neither Russia nor any other entity on the planet has ever produced evidence that the Ukrainian government is comprised by a Nazi element. Also, part of Putin's ideological premise was Russians and Ukrainians' shared history. According to Putin, that meant they were essentially one people, and thus Ukraine itself should be subsumed into Russia. And whether Putin truly believes any of those statements is impossible to say, but his full-throated endorsement of the claims and his continued adherence to them suggest that they are promoted by the people who surround him. In the months after the war began, it became clear that Putin does depend on the word of his inner circle. In one notable incident, Western intelligence revealed that Putin had been intentionally misled by his advisors in the early days of the conflict, kept from learning the true nature of Russia's battlefield losses and strategic failures. In the following year and several months, Putin has repeatedly amplified beliefs and claims that clearly come from the people around him. Whether that's a matter of Putin and his trusted associates forming a cohesive messaging strategy, or a matter of Putin simply buying into what he's been told, we may never know. But what we do know is that even Ukraine has made it a priority to target not just Putin's military leaders, but his ideological guides. In August of 2022, Daria Dugina was killed in a car bomb attack outside Moscow in a targeted assassination meant for her father, Putin's philosopher, Alexander Dugin. Beyond the bluster of his public statements, Putin's true motivations to invade Ukraine center on the idea that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe has become intolerable. Of course, that interpretation simply ignores the fact that a NATO presence on Russia's border is not necessarily a threat to Russia at all, but when we take Putin in the grand view, it immediately becomes clear that the idea that NATO wouldn't be a threat to Russia just isn't a claim he would take seriously. Putin's view on NATO expansion has been remarkably consistent with time, even if that perception is inconsistent with the level of threats that NATO actually poses to him. Months before the invasion kicked off, Putin compared the expansion of American influence in Ukraine to the use of a weapon of mass destruction against Russia itself. Shortly afterward, he watched America's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, signaling, perhaps, that if ever there was a time to stop Ukraine's move to NATO before it happened, then that time had come. But then, there's the question of the invasion itself, which, as we've covered extensively on this channel, did not remotely compare to expectations. By the sheer numbers massing on the Ukrainian border, it was clear that Putin's plan had been a lightning assault, sweeping across the country as easily as Russia had done in Georgia. Had that happened, Putin might have declared himself victorious in his grand aims and decided to reap the rewards of the Russia that he had created. Some analysts have even speculated after the fact that a decisive win in Ukraine would have been among Putin's last acts before stepping down and passing Russia to a successor. But none of that happened. Instead, the Russian military proved that it was incapable of launching any invasion that involved more than a couple of hours' drive. 200,000 Russian troops pushed into Ukrainian territory, stalled, failed to make it to Kiev, and were before long hammered with relentless counterattacks. Thousands were slaughtered, thousands more forced to fight desperately to save their own lives, and Russia's occupation was limited to Ukrainian regions close to the border or the Black Sea. The Russian military's stunning inadequacies were clearly not a part of the plan. Russia's oligarchs, including members of Putin's own inner circle, hadn't been given advance notice to move their assets, which were quickly confiscated abroad. Russia had badly underestimated Ukraine's will to fight, and Putin's points of economic leverage against the West proved not nearly so potent as his advisors would have had him believe. As we write this, the war in Ukraine still wages on, and barring a major reversal of somebody's fortunes, that'll still be the case by the time this episode is released. But to call it anything other than a catastrophe would be a bold-faced lie. Insofar as Russia's military failings, we've got to acknowledge here that that sort of ineptitude is nothing new. In Georgia, in 2008, Russian forces were caught seriously unprepared to launch a successful invasion and managed to stumble their way into victory largely due to overwhelming numbers and a short geographic distance to cover before achieving victory. The issues that had been observed in Georgia and even Chechnya were left ignored or proved unfixable even until 2022. But that too is further indication that Putin's vaunted powers of calculation had been off in a major way. To not grasp the failings of the Russian military is unusual for Putin, who, if nothing else, has historically been very good at understanding the nature of his own position. He was punished ruthlessly for his overstep by the West, not just by sanctions, but by a constant flow of weapons and arms into Ukraine. Any nuance on Putin that had remained in terms of global public opinion has now all but vanished. That's not to say that every onlooker around the world dislikes what they see, but his place on the international stage has become profoundly more polarized. After the war in Ukraine became Putin's new status quo, he proved able to approach the challenge with the same shrewdness as he's done in the past. After much diplomatic and economic wrangling, Putin has been able to secure the cooperation of a number of relevant nations in enabling Russian exports to continue. Internally, he's been able to hold the Russian Ministry of Defense away from total collapse while weathering a mutiny from the paramilitary Wagner Group. On the world stage, he's shifted the goalposts, blurring Russian expectations of a total victory and laying the groundwork for a ceasefire agreement that would allow Russia to keep the token victories of captured Donbass and Crimea. And at the time of writing, that's where things sit. In the weeks that this episode was being written and produced, Putin's noose around Russia has continued to tighten. Longtime opposition leader Alexei Navalny disappeared for a stretch of weeks without explanation from a detention center where he's serving a 30-year sentence, only to turn up at a brutal penal colony in the Arctic Circle. At the same time, Putin has begun back-channeling more forcefully toward a ceasefire agreement, provided that its terms are amenable to Russia. And a former TV journalist named Yekaterina Dunsova, who had mulled a run against Putin in the upcoming 2024 cycle, was disqualified from candidacy on the basis of flaws in her candidacy application form, a move widely understood to ensure that Putin will not be challenged seriously in the coming election. And that election when it inevitably falls in Putin's favor, will put him on track to begin a new 6-year term. If he completes it, he will have ruled Russia longer than Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union, and longer than Tsar Nicholas II was Russia's reigning emperor. If Putin does finish that next term, he'll be in his late 70s, and with 5 terms completed, well, what's one more? And maybe another one after that. Now, as we conclude the episode today, we cast our gaze tentatively into the future in an attempt to glean just how Vladimir Putin's story will end. Of course, we do know one thing: it's going to end in his demise one way or the other, and the long, slow fading away of the legacy that he leaves behind. But how that end will happen and when it will come is harder to say. First, the end of political Putin. It appears all but certain that Putin will be re-elected president in 2024, barring the not insignificant possibility that he might name his chosen successor acting president before then, just like Boris Yeltsin did for him. History in Putin's world tends to rhyme now as often as ever. But if and when he does step down, the question of who will replace him looms large. Nikolai Patrushev tops most lists. He's secretary of the Russian Security Council, and he's not only Putin's right-hand man, but a more extreme adherent to most of the same ideologies as Putin. Dmitry Medvedev is also a name widely in circulation, a known, predictable figure who's not exactly liked in Russia, but could be tolerated to return to the top job. There's also Alexei Dyumin, a little-known regional governor who once served as Putin's bodyguard, but is known to still have a close relationship with the Russian leader. And finally, there's the popular mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, who can't be counted out. If Putin were to die, or step down suddenly though, the presidency would go to someone else. Mikhail Mishustin, Russia's current prime minister. Mishustin isn't anyone's idea of a compelling candidate. He seems to be good at his job, he's well liked, and he doesn't make trouble, but he hasn't made much impact either. Of course, that description could also apply to one young Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, but even still, Mishustin's potential role in a future Russia is more to do with his station than his personality. He could also be a top choice in the unlikely event that Putin would be militarily deposed or targeted from inside the Kremlin, although both of those options would be a rather massive surprise. But let's circle back to one other possibility: that Putin might die, and possibly sooner than later. Putin isn't young by any means. He's 71 in a nation where men are expected to live to about 73. But it's the more targeted speculation we're talking about here. Specifically, that Putin may have cancer. Now, these rumors aren't new. From 2016 to 2019, Putin was frequently observed traveling with a thyroid cancer surgeon and several other doctors. According to US intelligence leaders who made remarks to Newsweek in 2022, Putin is believed to have undergone treatment that year for advanced cancer. In public appearances, Putin has been slouching down in his seat, gripping onto tables while he sat, suffering from what seems to be uncontrollable spasms in his legs and looking visibly sick and bloated on camera. And beyond the Russian leader's physical health, his mental stability has also been called into question as well. Putin's ravings before and during the invasion of Ukraine haven't just gotten stranger, they seem to almost have lost touch with reality. Take, for example, an incident in 2021 in which he claimed outright that leaders of opposition groups in the West, people equivalent to his own Alexei Navalny, would be killed or imprisoned by state authorities as a matter of course. Or take his equally unbelievable claim that Russia's restrictions on freedom of the press were far looser than what Western nations allow from their own media. Or take his uncanny valley, clearly staged meetings with his top officials, published globally at the start of the war and as it's gone on, in which Putin seems to demand outright subservience to his goals from each of his ministers. Some experts suggest that such spectacles are an intentional ploy to make Putin seem unstable, thus making hostile leaders uncertain of how to handle him. Others, though, suggest that these choices may be a facet of his isolation inside a bubble of his allies, or worse, a devolution in his ability to understand the world around him. What a physically or mentally deteriorating Putin means for Russia, for Ukraine, and for the West could go a few ways. It increases the likelihood of a sudden transfer of power in Russia, or even a sudden explosion into political infighting. It may raise his likelihood of ordering ill-advised or indiscriminate attacks during the war in Ukraine. Conversely, it may lead to his inner circle putting up safeguards around him, trying to diminish his ability to exercise his own power, or perhaps taking the keys to the Kremlin without him noticing. All those possibilities and more are in clearer focus than ever as Putin continues to deteriorate. When his clock will run out, not even he knows. As we conclude today's episode, it's with a nod to the incredible complexity of the man that is Vladimir Putin. A dictator, a new age Tsar, a brutal warlord, absolutely. And yet all the more important to understand as a result. This is a man born in a city still reeling from an apocalyptic siege in which thousands of people were eventually charged for having eaten their neighbors. Just the question of how a person survives, growing up in a place like that, already provides plenty of fodder for speculation on just what sort of lessons built Putin into the man that he is today. Add to that the layers upon layers upon layers of Putin's experiences, his worldview, his surroundings, and the unlikely coincidences that elevated him to power, and his story is one that resists simplicity. For so many observers around the world, he is a man that is utterly incomprehensible. Yet take him in his totality, and the thing that he's become at least begins to make sense.